The great hall of Iron Moon Keep had never felt so quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settled over a room when everyone was at ease. This was the kind of quiet that pressed down on a person's chest and made breathing feel like a task that required effort. Every candle in the hall burned straight and still. No wind moved through the high stone arches. The hundreds of wolves who stood in rows along the walls did not shuffle or whisper or shift their weight. They simply stared forward, because the Alpha King had not yet spoken. And when the Alpha King had not yet spoken, no one in Iron Moon dared to make a sound. Kalen Voss stood at the front of the hall on the raised stone platform that his grandfather had built, and his father had stood upon, and that he now owned, with the kind of comfortable authority that came from never once doubting himself. He was tall in the way that kings are tall, not just in body, but in the space he occupied. His shoulders were broad, his jaw was set hard, and his dark eyes moved slowly across the gathered crowd, with the calm certainty of a man who had never been told no, and had no reason to expect it now. Tonight was the binding ceremony. It happened once each year, on the night of the first full moon after the solstice. Every unmated wolf of age was brought before the Alpha King, and the old bond magic was allowed to stir. Sometimes nothing happened, sometimes it did. When it did, everyone in the room felt it, a warmth that moved through the air like the first breath of spring through a closed window. Kalen had stood through 11 of these ceremonies without the bond magic touching him even once. He had long since stopped expecting it to. He was watching the line of wolves who stood waiting along the far wall when it happened. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself with light or sound. It was simply a pull, deep in the center of his chest, so sudden and so specific that he actually stopped breathing for a moment. His eyes moved without his permission to a girl standing near the end of the line. She was not looking at him. She was looking at her own hands, her head slightly bowed, her dark hair falling forward across her cheek. She was wearing a plain gray dress that was clean, but clearly not expensive. She did not belong to any of the noble bloodlines. He did not recognize her face. He did recognize the feeling. It was the mate bond. He had heard it described 100 times. His father had told him it was like a key turning in a lock you did not know was closed. His mother had told him it was like hearing your own name spoken by someone who already knew you before you were introduced. He had always thought those descriptions were too poetic to be accurate. They were not. The girl looked up then, as if something had pulled her attention the same way something had pulled his. Her eyes were the color of shallow river water, gray-green and clear and very steady. She found his face immediately, without searching, which told him the pull had gone both ways. For a moment she just looked at him. There was no nervousness in her expression, no excitement. There was something that looked almost like recognition, which made no sense at all because he had never seen her before in his life. Then she looked back down at her hands. Around him, Kalen heard the faintest ripple of sound pass through the gathered wolves. They had felt it too, or at least enough of it to know that something had happened. He heard whispers begin to move through the crowd. He saw his head advisor, a gray-haired wolf named Osric, turn his head sharply, and look first at the girl, and then at Kalen, with an expression that was not quite alarm, but was not far from it either. Kalen said nothing. He kept his face still. He was very good at keeping his face still. The ceremony continued. 3 other bonds sparked that evening, quieter ones, between wolves of similar standing, who pressed their foreheads together and laughed with relief and joy in front of the hall. Kalen watched them receive the traditional blessing and tried to think clearly about what had just happened to him. He already knew what he was going to do. He had known it before the ceremony ended, before the hall began to empty, before Osric came and stood beside him with the careful posture of a man who had something difficult to say. "My king," Osric said, keeping his voice low enough that only Kalen could hear. "She is Sarah Ashvale, Border Clan. The Ashvale line has held the eastern boundary for 4 generations. Good fighters, loyal wolves, but no title, no land, no standing in the high court. I know what a border clan is, Osric. Of course." A pause. "There is also the matter of your arrangement with Lord Cruel. Lady Dagna has been waiting 3 years for the formal announcement. The Northern Alliance is waiting with her. If you were to take a border clan mate instead of a highborn queen, the Northern Lords would see it as an insult. Some of them might take it as grounds to withdraw their support entirely." Kalen was quiet for a long moment. He looked across the emptying hall to where the girl, Sarah, was standing near the door with 2 other Border Clan wolves who were clearly her kin. She was listening to one of them say something, nodding slightly, and there was a small line between her brows that suggested she was thinking hard about something she was not saying out loud. She did not look toward him. She was pointedly not looking toward him, in fact, which meant she was very aware of where he was. The bond magic pulled again, gently, like a current in deep water. He turned away from it. "Bring her to the east corridor," he said to Osric. "Privately. I will speak with her there." Osric nodded and moved away without another word, because he was a man who had spent 30 years in service to the Voss line, and he knew what Kaelin's quiet tone meant when he used it. Sarah was brought to the east corridor 10 minutes later by 2 palace guards, who had not told her why. She stood in the torchlight with her hands at her sides, and her chin level, and her eyes showing nothing except the kind of careful attention that people learned when they grew up in places where missing important information had real consequences. Kaelin came into the corridor alone. He stopped at a distance that was respectful but not warm, and he looked at her for a moment before speaking. "You know what happened in the hall tonight," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. Her voice was lower than he expected, steady. "I want to be honest with you," he said, and he meant it, at least in this moment. "The bond is real. I felt it. I believe you felt it too." She waited, watching him. "But I have obligations that existed before tonight," he said. "Political arrangements that carry the stability of this kingdom in them. I have a duty to Iron Moon that is older than any bond, and I will not put that duty aside, not for this." He paused. "I want you to understand that this is not about your worth. It is about what a king can and cannot afford to choose." The corridor was very quiet. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. He could not read what was moving behind her eyes, which he found unexpectedly uncomfortable. He was very accustomed to being readable himself, while others remained readable to him. She was doing neither. "You are going to reject the bond," she said. "I am going to make the choice that keeps this kingdom safe," he said. She nodded once, a very small nod. "Then I will need to leave Iron Moon." "Yes," he said. "You will." He said it evenly, because saying it evenly was the only way he knew how to say something like this, without allowing it to cost him something he could not afford to give. "The palace will provide you with travel provisions and safe passage to whatever border you choose. You will be given enough coin to establish yourself somewhere new. You have done nothing wrong, and you will not be treated as if you have." "How generous," she said, and there was absolutely nothing in her tone that told him whether she meant that honestly or not. He held her gaze. The bond pulled at him, stronger now, as if it understood what was happening and was making its objection known. He set his jaw and held very still against it, the way a man holds still against a wind that is trying to push him sideways. "I am sorry," he said, genuinely. She looked at him one more time, then she looked away, toward the dark window at the end of the corridor, and for just a moment something moved across her face that he did not have a name for. It was not grief exactly. It was more like a quiet kind of certainty, as if she was confirming something she had already suspected about the world. "You do not need to be sorry," she said. "You just need to decide, and it sounds like you already have." She was right. He had. She left Iron Moon before the sun came up the next morning. He watched from the high tower window as the small supply cart rolled through the eastern gate and disappeared into the gray pre-dawn light, carrying her and the 2 Border Clan wolves who had come with her, and would presumably go with her now, into whatever life she built somewhere else. He stood at the window for longer than he intended to. The bond sat in his chest like a bruise, tender when he pressed his attention against it, which he made himself stop doing. There were things to attend to. There were always things to attend to. He was the Alpha King of Iron Moon, and Iron Moon did not pause for a man's feelings, even the feelings of its king. He went back to his desk. He sent a letter to Lord Cruel that afternoon, confirming the arrangement with Lady Dagna. He wrote it in his own hand, using the formal language his tutors had drilled into him as a boy, and he sealed it with the Iron Moon crest and sent it north with a fast rider. His wolf did not howl. His wolf did not do anything at all that day, which was unusual. Normally his wolf was present to him in small ways throughout his waking hours, a warm awareness at the back of his mind, the low hum of a second self that shared his body and his instincts. After Sarah's cart disappeared through the eastern gate, His wolf went quiet. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself that for a long time. In the weeks that followed the binding ceremony, the court moved on the way courts always moved on, which was quickly and without much sentimentality. The preparations for the formal announcement of his betrothal to Dagna began. Invitations went out. The palace kitchens received new orders. The seamstress who kept the Iron Moon court dressed was brought in to discuss formal wear for the announcement ceremony, and she brought fabric samples and spoke for 40 minutes about colors and thread counts, while Kalen sat behind his desk and answered her questions in the correct number of syllables, without registering a single word of what she said. He thought about the girl at the window of the east corridor, the look on her face when she turned toward the dark glass. He stopped thinking about it, because it was not useful. Dagna arrived from the north 6 weeks later in a procession of 12 carriages and 30 armed wolves in the cruel family colors, which were white and deep red. She was a handsome woman, with precise manners, and a voice that carried confidence in every syllable. She was intelligent and politically astute, and she understood the arrangement between them with the same clear-eyed practicality that he did. She did not expect romance. She expected partnership, and she was prepared to be good at it. He respected her. He tried to be grateful for that. The formal announcement ceremony took place on a clear evening in the Iron Moon courtyard, with the full court assembled and the northern lords present in their finest. Kalen stood beside Dagna on the platform where his father had stood beside his mother, and the crowd below them raised their voices in the traditional acknowledgement, and the Northern Alliance nodded their collective approval, and the political architecture that held the kingdom together remained standing. He smiled when smiling was appropriate. He said the right things. His wolf stayed quiet. That night, alone in his private rooms after the celebration had wound down and the guests had gone to their chambers and the servants had cleared the courtyard, Kalen sat beside the window that faced east and allowed himself, briefly, to press his awareness against the place in his chest where the bond had been. It was still there, faint and bruised feeling, like a coal that has not quite gone cold. He did not know what that meant about Sarah, whether she still felt it too, whether the rejection had been complete or only partial. He knew that a rejected bond did not simply disappear. He knew it left marks on both wolves. He had done that to her. He pressed the thought down firmly. He was the Alpha King. He had made the only decision that was right for his kingdom. He had been honest with her, which was more than many men would have been. He had given her provisions and coin and safe passage. He had not been cruel. He told himself that. He sat beside the east window for a long time in the dark and told himself all of it, every reasonable and logical piece of it, until it felt like something he could carry without stumbling under the weight. Then he went to bed. 300 miles to the east, in a traveler's inn near the Solmir border, Sarah sat on the edge of a narrow bed and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, until the tightness in her chest began to ease to something manageable. She did not cry. She had decided on the cart ride that she was not going to cry, and she was good at deciding things and then doing them. She was her father's daughter, and her father had raised her to know that feelings were real and important, but that they were not in charge. You felt them, you acknowledged them, you kept moving. She kept moving. She had coin in her bag, enough to last several months if she was careful. She had her own skills, which were considerable, because Border Clan wolves were trained from childhood to do everything that needed doing, without waiting for someone else to do it first. She could hunt. She could navigate by stars. She could start a fire in the rain, and set a broken bone, and read a weather sky. She would be all right. She pressed her hands against her knees, and breathed, and was very deliberately all right. She did not let herself think about the way the bond had felt when it first sparked in the hall. She did not let herself think about the look on his face when he stood in the corridor, the brief and genuine apology in his eyes before he shut himself back behind whatever wall he lived behind. She did not think about any of it. She thought about what came next instead. The Solmir border was 2 days' travel east. She had heard good things about Solmir. She had heard it was a fair kingdom, that its king was not unkind, that there was work available for skilled wolves who did not require the shelter of a noble house. That was enough to aim for. She lay down on the narrow bed and closed her eyes. In her chest, buried under the pain of the rejection, the bond sat very still, like something holding its breath. She would feel it for years. She already knew that. A rejected bond did not go away, it just changed shape, became something you learned to live beside, the way you learned to live beside an old injury, aware of it in cold weather, careful around it when you were tired, but not ruled by it on ordinary days. She was going to have a great many ordinary days. She fell asleep in the Traveler's Inn, near the Solmere border, alone, with her travel bag tucked under the bed and her boots still on. And outside the window the trees moved in a wind that came from the west, from the direction of Iron Moon, carrying nothing with it except cold air. In the morning, she rose before dawn, washed her face in the basin, checked her coin, and walked east. She did not look back. The Solmere border was marked by a line of old stone pillars that had been there so long the moss had grown halfway up their sides, and birds had nested in the cracks at their tops. Sarah crossed between two of them at midday on her third day of walking, and felt, not relief exactly, but something like the small relaxation of a knot that had been pulled tight for too long. She had not made it to the inn she intended to reach that evening. She had not made it because the weather turned without warning in the early afternoon, the sky going from gray to dark gray, to a bruised, low-hanging purple in the space of an hour, and the rain that came after was the kind of rain that did not fall so much as drive itself sideways through the air, and through every layer of clothing a person wore, until there was nothing dry left anywhere on the body. Sarah pulled her coat tighter and kept walking, because there was nothing else to do. The road was a dirt track that had softened to mud under the rain. Her boots sank with each step. The trees that lined the road gave almost no shelter, because the wind was pushing the rain in from the east, and the trees leaned west under it, their branches pressed flat. She was focused entirely on the problem of the next 10 feet of road, when her foot came down on a patch of mud that was deeper than it looked, and she went down hard, catching herself on her hands and one knee. And in catching herself she twisted her ankle at an angle that sent a sharp complaint up through her leg. She sat in the mud for a moment. Then she got up and kept walking, because sitting in the mud in a rainstorm was not going to help anything. The ankle was not broken. She knew what a break felt like. She had broken her left arm at 12, falling out of a border watch tree, and she had kept her arm still, and walked herself 2 miles back to camp before telling anyone, so she had some experience with what broken bones asked of you. This ankle was a sprain at worst. It hurt with every step, but it held her weight, which was the important thing. She was limping and thoroughly soaked, and the daylight was going fast when she smelled the wood smoke. It was coming from the left, through a gap in the trees, and she turned toward it without hesitation, because wood smoke meant shelter, and shelter was what the situation required. She pushed through the tree line and found a clearing with a small stone building in it, something that had once been a shepherd's outpost or a wayfarer's rest, its roof still intact and its door ajar, and firelight flickering through the single small window. She went toward it. She was almost at the door when the sound of horses reached her, hooves on the road she had just left, and then voices, men talking in the clipped, formal way of soldiers on a route march. She looked back through the trees. The torches they carried threw moving light across the wet trunks. She pushed the door of the stone building open and stepped inside. There were 4 people already in the room. 3 of them were soldiers. They wore the gold and gray of Solmere, their armor wet from the rain, their hands wrapped around wooden cups that steamed in the cold air. The 4th was a man who sat apart from the soldiers in the corner nearest the fire, his long legs stretched out in front of him, a book open across his knee that he had apparently been reading until the door opened. He looked up. He was perhaps 30, maybe a few years more, with the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome, but was very difficult not to look at, because the bones of it were interesting, and the expression on it was very present, very attentive, the face of someone who actually looked at things, rather than glancing at them and moving on. His eyes were a dark, warm amber. His hair was brown, slightly too long, pushed back from his face in a way that suggested he had pushed it back recently, and would forget to cut it again soon. He was wearing plain riding clothes and a wool coat, no armor, no visible insignia. He could have been a merchant, or a scholar, or a wealthy farmer's son, except that the 3 soldiers had all straightened when she opened the door, and then looked immediately at this man in the corner, waiting for his cue. "Come in," he said, as if the decision were his to make. Which meant it probably was. "You look like the road has been unkind to you." "The road was fine," Sarah said. She came in and pulled the door shut behind her. It was the weather that had opinions. One corner of his mouth moved upward. Fair assessment. There's a stool near the fire. Sit down before your ankle gives out. She looked at him. You have been favoring your left foot since you came through the tree line, he said, without any particular emphasis on it. I could see you from the window. She went to the stool and sat down, because her ankle was genuinely complaining, and she was not going to prove a point by standing on it. Sarah Ashvale, she said, because she had been raised to introduce herself plainly, and there was no reason to change that now. Border Clan, formerly of Iron Moon, currently unaffiliated. He closed his book. Currently in Solmere, he said, which means currently under Solmere's protection, if you want it. I have only been in Solmere for approximately 4 hours, she said. I did not know protection was available on arrival. It is, he said simply, Aldrich Solmere. He said his own name the same way she had said hers, just a name, no title attached. She looked at him for a moment. The 3 soldiers were still sitting with the very particular stillness of people who were waiting to see if they were going to need to do anything. You are the king, she said. Yes, he said. Though I try not to make it the first thing I mention when I meet someone in a shepherd's hut in a rainstorm, because it tends to make the conversation awkward. Why are you in a shepherd's hut in a rainstorm? The same reason you are, I expect. The storm moved faster than the map suggested it would, and this was the nearest roof. He looked at her ankle, which she had instinctively extended toward the fire, because the heat felt good on it. Have you eaten today? She started to say yes, and then stopped, because honesty was easier and less exhausting. Not since morning. He said something to one of the soldiers in a low voice. The soldier got up without being told twice, and went to a pack near the door, and came back with bread and dried meat, and a flask of something warm, that turned out to be spiced broth. Sarah took it and ate, without making a ceremony of it, because she was hungry, and there was no point pretending otherwise. Aldrich went back to his book. He did not watch her eat, which she noted. The fire crackled. Outside, the rain hit the stone walls with a sound like 1,000 small arguments. The soldiers talked quietly among themselves in the way of men who had been in each other's company long enough to have run through all the interesting conversations and arrived at the comfortable ones. After a while, Sarah said, You do not want to know why I am here. I assume you will tell me if it matters, he said, without looking up from his book. I am here because I was asked to leave a different kingdom. He looked up then. Not with alarm, with the careful attention she was beginning to understand, was simply how he looked at things. Were you treated badly? She thought about the east corridor, and the torchlight, and Kalen's even, apologetic, utterly immovable expression. No, she said. Not badly, just clearly. He held her gaze for a moment, seeming to hear the thing under what she said, and choosing, deliberately, not to dig at it. There is work in Solmere for wolves who want it, he said. Good work. The border watch along our southern line is skilled but understaffed. If you are a trained fighter, which I suspect you are, given your bearing, you would be welcomed. He paused. There is also simply the option of staying. Solmere does not turn people away who have done nothing wrong. You do not know me, she said. You have known me for the length of time it takes to eat a piece of bread. True, he said. But I know Border Clan wolves. Your people have held the Eastern Iron Moon line for as long as Solmere has kept records. They are not people I would turn away on a rainy night without very good reason, and I do not currently have one. Sarah looked at the fire. The warmth was reaching the inside of her coat now, and the broth had settled the hollow feeling in her stomach, and the ankle, elevated on the stone lip of the hearth, was beginning to feel less urgent. She was, she realized, the most comfortable she had been in 4 days. I will think about the border watch, she said. Good, Aldrich said, and went back to his book. She stayed in the shelter that night, sleeping on a rolled blanket that one of the soldiers provided without being asked, and in the morning, the rain had stopped, and the sky was the clean, washed blue that sometimes followed a hard storm. She woke before the others, and went outside, and stood in the clearing, and breathed in the cold, wet smell of the trees, and felt the Iron Moon bond sitting in its corner of her chest, very still, very quiet, neither better nor worse than it had been the night before. She thought about Kalen Voss. She thought about him the way you think about a wound when it is still new, with a kind of careful, detailed attention that is partly assessment and partly just the brain's way of understanding what happened. He had looked at her and felt the bond and chosen something else. She could not even say he was entirely wrong to do it. Kingdoms were not small things. The people inside them were not small things either, and a king who upended his political alliances for a feeling, however deep and real, might do more harm than good to the people he was responsible for protecting. She could understand it and still be hurt by it. Both things were true at once, which was irritating, because it would have been simpler to be only hurt, to be able to point at him and say, this was the wrong person, this was a bad man, this was a choice made from selfishness alone. But she had looked at him in that corridor, and she had seen that he believed what he was saying. He thought he was doing the right thing. Men who thought they were doing the right thing were the hardest kind to be angry at, because the anger had nowhere solid to land. She stood in the clearing until she heard movement inside the shelter behind her, and then she made herself think about the present moment, which was the only useful place for her thoughts to be. Aldrich came out of the shelter with the composed, unhurried energy of someone who was accustomed to waking and being immediately presentable. He stood beside her and looked at the sky. Better, he said. Much better, she agreed. They rode to the nearest Solmere town together. Aldrich rode with his soldiers, and Sarah rode a spare horse that materialized from somewhere in the way that things materialized for kings, without anyone making a fuss about it. The town was small, but well kept, with stone buildings, and a central square with a market in it, and wolves, who stopped what they were doing to acknowledge their king with a nod or a word, not with the rigid formal reverence that she had seen in Iron Moon's court, but with the comfortable recognition of people who had encountered this particular king before, and found him reasonable. Aldrich stopped at an inn, and spoke with the keeper for a few minutes. Then he came back to where Sarah was standing and said, "Your room is paid for through the week. The town healer is on the south side of the square. She is very good with sprains. She will not charge you for the visit." Sarah looked at him. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. A pause stretched between them. "Why?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated, because it meant he was going to answer honestly, rather than quickly. "Because you crossed a border in a rainstorm alone, with a sprained ankle, and did not ask for anything," he said. "That tells me something about you. Specifically, that you are not the kind of person who takes things they have not earned, which means if I give you something, it will mean something to you." She did not know what to say to that. He touched the front of his coat in the small gesture of a man adjusting his collar before remounting. "The Border Watch offer is real, if you want it. Ask for Commander Ellis in the garrison, at the south end of town. Tell him I sent you." He rode away with his soldiers, back toward wherever kings went when they were done being caught in rainstorms. Sarah stood in the square with the Solmere morning sun coming across the rooftops, and the market sounds rising around her, and she thought that it was strange how clearly a person could see the character of a place in the first hours of being in it. Iron Moon had been grand and precise and faintly cold, its beauty the kind that asked you to look but not touch. Solmere felt different, not grand exactly, but deeply comfortable, like a coat that had been worn in until it fit. She went to find the healer. Her ankle was a moderate sprain, which the healer wrapped with practiced efficiency, while telling her about the history of the southern garrison and the quality of the venison at the inn's kitchen. Sarah listened and asked questions and gathered information, which was what she did when she was rebuilding, because gathering information was the first step toward having a plan, and having a plan was the first step toward not needing anyone's help to stay upright. She found Commander Ellis that afternoon. He was a stocky, blunt-spoken woman in her early 40s, with close-cropped gray hair, and hands that were scarred from a long career of doing things that caused hands to scar. She looked at Sarah's letter from Aldrich, read it twice, looked at Sarah, and said, "Can you track? Not just follow, actually track. Night tracking, rain tracking, cold ground tracking." "Yes," Sarah said. "What is your range in wolf form?" "I have covered 30 miles in a night when I needed to." Ellis looked at her for a long moment. "You start Monday," she said. "Housing is in the garrison. Meals are included, pay is fair. I do not run a pleasant operation, but I run an honest one. If you have a problem, you bring it to me directly and I deal with it. If I have a problem with you, I will tell you directly, and you will deal with it. Clear?" "Clear," Sarah said. She started on Monday. The garrison work was hard and physical and required her full attention, which was exactly what she needed. She tracked and patrolled and trained alongside wolves who were skilled and straightforward, and who asked no personal questions beyond what she could do and how well she could do it, which suited her very well. She was good at the work. She had always been good at exactly this kind of work, and there was a particular satisfaction in being good at something that had nothing to do with anything except her own ability. The bond in her chest did not stop hurting. But it became something she worked around, the way you worked around any old injury, carefully, and with the understanding that it was going to be part of the landscape from now on. She learned its rhythms. It ached more at night, when she was still and quiet, and had nothing to focus on, except the inside of her own head. It was quieter in the mornings, when the work of the day filled up her attention. On her off days, when there was nothing scheduled to occupy her, she read or walked or sat with Ellis over a cup of tea, and talked about garrison logistics, which was not a topic that left much room for feelings to creep in sideways. She had been at the garrison for 6 weeks when Aldrich came to inspect the southern border. He came with a small group, just 4 attendants and 2 advisors, none of the ceremony that she would have expected. He walked the garrison with Ellis, listened more than he talked, asked specific questions about staffing and supply lines, and did not make a performance of his attention the way that some officials did, performing interest without actually being interested. He was genuinely interested. That was clear. He saw Sarah during the midday break and stopped. "You look better," he said. "I am better," she said. "The work agrees with me." "Ellis says you are her best tracker," he said. "She does not say that about anyone quickly. Ellis says what is true and no more than what is true," Sarah said. "I like her. Most people who work for her say the same thing. Eventually," he said, "after the first few weeks where she makes them want to quit." "She made me want to be better," Sarah said, "which is different." He looked at her steadily. The amber eyes were very direct, the way she remembered them from the shepherd's hut. The eyes of someone who had a low tolerance for looking at things while pretending not to see them. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not the work. You." She held his gaze and thought about the honest answer. "Getting there," she said. He nodded, accepting that without pushing at it. "Good," he said, and moved on. She watched him walk across the garrison yard toward Ellis, and thought that there was something very unusual about a person who asked if you were all right, and then was satisfied with the actual answer, rather than the reassuring one. She went back to work. That evening she sat in the garrison common room with the fire going and the day's work settling out of her muscles, and she felt, for the first time since she had walked out of Iron Moon's eastern gate in the pre-dawn dark, something that was not quite happy, but was genuinely, solidly fine. She was going to be all right. She had known it that first night in the Traveler's Inn, as a decision she was making. Now it was becoming something true. 3 months into her posting at the Southern Garrison, Sarah learned what it meant to be seen by someone who was not in a hurry. She did not learn it in one moment. It happened the way most important things happened, quietly and in stages. Each small thing, so ordinary, that you did not notice it until you looked back and realized that a great deal had changed without any single event you could point to. Aldrich came to the southern border 6 times that season. Each visit was short, 1 or 2 days, and each time he came he did the same things. Walked the perimeter with Ellis, reviewed the supply records, spoke with the garrison wolves about their concerns. He did not treat these visits as inspections in the traditional sense. He treated them as conversations. He listened. He took notes in a small leather journal he kept in his coat pocket, and he followed up on things that had been raised in previous visits, which told everyone that he actually read the notes afterward. On the 3rd visit, he stopped at Sarah's post at the South Watch Point and said, "You changed the patrol rotation." She looked at him. Ellis approved it. "I know. I am asking why you changed it." She explained the logic, how the original rotation had 2 wolves covering the same ground at different times, which was less efficient than staggering them so the coverage was continuous. Aldrich listened and then asked 3 specific questions that told her he understood terrain and logistics well enough to have spotted the one potential weakness in her revised plan, which was the 40-minute gap at the far eastern point during shift change. She addressed it. He nodded. "Good," he said, and wrote something in his journal. He did not compliment her. He did not tell her the rotation was impressive or praise her initiative. He treated it the way he treated everything, as a thing that was true, and therefore worth engaging with seriously, not worth decorating with extra words. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated the compliment. On his fourth visit, he found her at the edge of the clearing east of the garrison at the end of her shift, sitting on a flat-topped boulder with her coat wrapped around her, and a bowl of food from the kitchen going cold in her hands, because she had sat down intending to eat it, and had ended up looking at the tree line instead, without actually eating anything. "Eating or thinking?" he said, coming up beside her and stopping at a comfortable distance. "Both," she said. "Neither. The food is cold now." "I have the same problem," he said. He sat on the far end of the boulder, which was long enough to accommodate two people without crowding either of them. "My advisors tell me I eat my meals the same way I read reports. Technically present but not really there." She looked at him sideways. "They told you that," she said. "Oswald has been with me for 14 years, he said. "He tells me everything. It is occasionally inconvenient." She almost smiled. She could feel it at the edges of her mouth. "What were you thinking about?" he said, not pushed, just offered as a question she could take or leave. She looked back at the tree line. She thought about deflecting. She thought about saying something general that sounded like an answer without being one. Then she thought that the man beside her had not, in 4 months of encountering her, once pretended to be something he was not, and it seemed wrong to respond to that with a performance. "I was thinking about whether I am staying," she said. A pause. "Staying in Solmere?" "Staying anywhere specifically," she said. "I have been in one place for 3 months, which is the longest I have been still since I left Ironmoon, and I do not know whether that is because this place suits me, or because I have been too tired to move again, and I am confusing tiredness for belonging." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird called from somewhere in the dark trees, and another answered it from further away. "Those two things can be true at once," he said. She looked at him. "Tiredness and belonging can both be real," he said. "Being tired does not make belonging false. Sometimes people stop because they are exhausted, and then realize, when they are rested enough to think clearly, that the place they stopped is actually right." She thought about that. "Do you have advice?" she said, "or are you just thinking out loud?" "Mostly the second thing," he said, "though the advice, if you want it, is simple. Stay through the winter. If you still want to leave in spring, leave, but decisions made in the middle of being unsettled are usually not the right ones." "Stay through winter," she repeated. "The work is good. The people here are good. And the snow in the southern hills is very beautiful if you can tolerate the cold." She looked at the trees and thought about Ironmoon, and the way its eastern gate had looked in the pre-dawn dark, and the cold road that had stretched out ahead of her, with no particular destination on it. She thought about this garrison, and Ellis's blunt, honest company, and the work that took everything she had, and gave back the clean satisfaction of something well done. "I can tolerate the cold," she said. She stayed through winter. The snow came in late November and stayed until March, covering the southern hills in the way Aldrich had promised, which was genuinely beautiful in the way of things that are very large, and very still, and very white. Sarah learned to track in snow, which was different from tracking in mud or on dry ground, and she learned it well enough that by midwinter Ellis was sending her out alone on the longer patrols that the newer garrison wolves were not yet ready for. Aldrich came in December and brought with him 2 advisors and a cartographer, who spent 3 days remapping the southern terrain with new accuracy. He also brought, in one of the supply carts, 3 crates of books that were distributed among the garrison's small library, which had been running short on new material. Sarah found one of the new books on the shelf the evening they arrived, a thick text on pack law and territorial agreements that she would not have expected to be interesting, and turned out to be extremely interesting, and she was already 20 pages in when she heard a knock on the garrison library door. Aldrich stood in the doorway with 2 cups of tea. "Oswald told me someone had already taken the pack law text," he said. "I suspected it was you." She looked at him over the top of the book. "You were going to read it?" "I was going to keep it in my chambers for the duration of the visit. I brought it because I wanted to read it, but I can do without it if you have it." "Sit down," she said. "It is large enough to share." He sat down across the small library table from her, which was not something she had planned to say, and yet had come out as naturally as if she had been saying it for years. He wrapped his hands around his cup and opened his journal, and they sat in the garrison library in the winter quiet for 2 hours, reading. not talking, with the snow falling past the single window and the fire doing its work in the corner. She did not look up often. But when she did, she found that he was very comfortable to be in a room with. He had the rare quality of people who were completely at ease with silence, who did not feel the need to fill it with noise or conversation to prove they were present. He was present. He was simply also quiet. When she finally closed the book, her eyes tired from the small print, he was still writing in his journal. "Good," he said, without looking up. "Very good," she said. "The chapter on territorial agreements in shared border disputes alone is worth it." Page 212, he said. "The case between the Morven and Castle territories in the Old Kingdom records. I was hoping to find something useful in it for the situation along our northern line." She had not read that far yet. "Is the northern situation complicated?" "It is becoming complicated," he said, "which is different from being complicated yet. I prefer to think ahead if I can." He looked up. "If you are interested in reading the relevant sections, I would be glad to have a second opinion on the territorial logic." She looked at him. "I am a garrison tracker," she said, "not a political advisor." "You are someone who reads pack law texts for pleasure," he said, "and whose revised patrol rotation closed a strategic gap that I can tell you my formal advisors did not notice. I am not particular about job titles when it comes to useful thinking." She picked up the book again. "Tell me about the northern situation," she said. He told her. It took most of the evening. It was a boundary dispute that had been simmering for 2 generations between Solmere and a territory to the northeast called the Brackwall Lands, whose new leader had begun pushing the border markers 3 feet per season in the way of someone testing incrementally how much they could take before anyone pushed back. It was the kind of problem that was not yet a crisis, but would become one if it was not addressed with the right combination of firmness and care. Sarah listened and asked questions, and at the end said, "The Morven case on page 212 is directly applicable. The resolution was a surveyed marker agreement with a neutral third party present. If you can get Brackwall to agree to a joint survey, you lock the border in writing and take the incremental pushing off the table." Aldrich looked at her. "Oswald suggested the same thing," he said, "but he thought Brackwall would refuse." "Brackwall will refuse if you ask them directly," she said. "But if the survey is proposed through a third-party mediator, it is harder to refuse without looking like the aggressor. And Brackwall does not want to be seen as the aggressor, because they know they already are one." He wrote something in his journal. "You should have been a diplomatic advisor," he said. "I grew up on a contested border," she said. "You learn to read territorial logic from the ground up." He looked at her with the warm amber eyes that were always so directly attentive, and she felt, for just a moment, something she had not quite felt since the night of the binding ceremony. A small, quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and nothing to do with the tea. She picked up the book and found page 212. "I will read the case through," she said. "If there are arguments in it that are useful to you, I will mark them." "Thank you," he said. She read. He wrote. Outside, the snow continued. When she came to know him better, which she did over the months that followed, she understood that Aldrich was a person who had decided very early in life that the way to do anything was to do it fully. He did not give it out like something that cost nothing. When he directed it at a problem, or a person, or a page of text, he brought all of it, and the experience of being on the receiving end of that attention was something that required adjustment, because most people did not look that carefully. She had spent most of her life in the company of people who were sharp and capable and loyal to one another, in the uncomplicated way of pack-raised wolves, where the bonds between people were real, but the words for them were functional rather than deep. Her father had loved her fiercely, and shown it by teaching her everything he knew. Her mother had been warm and consistent, and present in the way of a person who understood that showing up was the most important thing, but no one in her life had ever paid attention to her the way Aldrich paid attention. It was uncomfortable, and then it was not. She learned to recognize his particular habits of mind. He asked more questions than he made statements. He remembered everything, which was not just a memory quirk but a form of respect. The way he would return 3 weeks later to something she had mentioned in passing and ask how it had resolved, which meant he had been carrying it that whole time as something worth returning to. He did not talk about himself easily, but when he did, the things he said were precise and honest, in the way of someone who had thought them through, rather than reaching for whatever sounded right. He had been married once. She learned that in February, when a late-season messenger arrived at the garrison with documents that required Aldrich's immediate attention, and one of the attendants mentioned the silver ring he still wore on his right hand. She did not ask about it. He told her himself, that evening, without dramatic build-up, simply as a thing that was true. Her name was Cora, he said. She died 4 years ago. A fever that came fast, and did not give much warning. A pause. We had 2 years together. They were good years. Sarah looked at her cup. I am sorry, she said. Thank you, he said. It was the kind of grief that changes shape but does not leave. I have learned to carry it differently as time passes, but I do not expect it to disappear. She understood that. The bond in her chest understood it too, she thought. Grief that changed shape but did not leave. Rylan would have had a brother, Aldrich said quietly, and then stopped. She looked at him. She had not heard the name before. Cora lost a child, he said, after a moment. Before she died. That was when we first understood she was ill. The fire crackled between them. I am very sorry, Sarah said, and she meant it fully, with the specific weight of a person who understood what loss felt like from the inside. He nodded. He did not make more of it than it was, but he also did not put it away quickly, which she appreciated. He let it sit in the room between them, the way honest things deserve to sit, acknowledged and real. They talked about other things after that. They talked about the pack law book, which she had finished, and about a letter he had received from the northern governor, and about the best route for the spring patrol rotations. They talked the way they had learned to talk over the winter months, with ease, with genuine interest, with no performance in it. She rode back to the garrison that night under a sky that was finally beginning to warm at its edges, the first faint suggestion of a season changing. She thought about all the things Aldrich was. Patient, observant, direct without being hard. Honest in the way that cost something, not the easy honesty of things that did not matter, but the harder kind. The kind that required you to actually look at yourself and report what was there without dressing it up. She thought about the bond in her chest, which had been sitting quietly all winter, and was sitting quietly now. She had not forgotten Kalen Voss. She did not think she would ever entirely forget him, because the mate bond was not the kind of thing that forgetting was possible with. It had simply settled into its place in the architecture of her life, painful and real, and no longer running the place. It did not rule her mornings. It did not follow her into the work. And now there was this other thing, quieter and stranger, and built out of 2 people reading books across a table from each other, in a garrison library in the snow, which was such an unlikely beginning, that it would have been funny if it had not also been the most genuine thing she had felt in a very long time. She did not know what to do with it yet. She rode back to the garrison, under the warming sky, and let herself not know, because Aldrich had taught her, without intending to, that not knowing was not the same as not being all right. She was all right. She was more than all right, in fact, though she was not ready to say that out loud to anyone, including herself. But it was there, quiet and real, and growing in the way of things that grew without being pushed. She could feel it the way you could feel a spring coming before it technically arrived, in the air and the light and the small green things pushing up through the edges of the frost. Something was happening. She let it happen. She knew she was carrying a child before the garrison healer told her. She had known for nearly 2 weeks before she spoke to anyone about it, in the way that bodies carry knowledge before the mind is ready to receive it. She had felt it as a shift in weight, not of the body exactly, but of something more fundamental, the sense of a second presence that was still too small to name, but was already entirely real. She told the healer on a Tuesday morning, when the garrison was quiet, and Ellis was away on a supply run, and there was no one nearby to hear anything. The healer, a small, careful woman named Marin, who had been working with garrison wolves for 20 years, asked her a series of practical questions, and then sat with her at the small table in the infirmary, and said, without judgment, "You are approximately 8 to 10 weeks along. You are healthy. The child is healthy. Is there anything else you need from me right now?" Sarah thought about it. "No," she said. "Thank you." She walked back to her barracks room, and sat on the edge of her bed, and put her hands flat on her knees, in the way she had learned to sit when she needed to think clearly. without letting feeling run ahead of thought. The child was Kaylin's. There was no question of that. The timing was exact. And beyond the timing, there was the fact that the mate bond was the only significant thread that had run through her life in the last year. The bond and the rejection of it, and the road east and the garrison, and Aldrich, and the winter of slow, careful rebuilding. She thought about what this meant. She thought about it from every angle she could reach, and the thing that settled in her after a long time of thinking was this. She was not going to send word to Ironmoon, not out of spite and not out of fear, but because she had thought it through fully and arrived at a clean conclusion. Kaylin Voss had made his decision in the east corridor of his palace, clearly and finally, and without leaving room for revision. He had looked at the mate bond and chosen something he valued more. She respected the deliberateness of that, as much as she had been hurt by it. But a deliberate choice carried its consequences. He had chosen his kingdom and his alliance, and the clean political future that she would have complicated. The child who was now growing inside her was a consequence that the same logic applied to. He had chosen not to be part of her life. She was going to honor that choice by not making his life harder. She was also going to make absolutely sure this child had everything it needed. That was the only urgent question. She went to find Aldrich. He was in the garrison's back room with his maps and his notes, working with the cartographer who was still revising the southern border charts. She waited until the cartographer stepped out, and then she came into the room and closed the door and said, without preamble, because she had learned that Aldrich received direct information better than circled information, "I am going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you respond." He put down his pen. "I am pregnant," she said. "Approximately 9 weeks. The child belongs to the King of Ironmoon, who does not know, and who I am not going to tell, by my own choice, for reasons I can explain if you want them explained. I do not need anything from you. I am telling you because you have been honest with me this winter, and I will not manage this dishonestly in front of someone who deserves better than that." The room was quiet. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment, with the focused attention that she had come to know as his way of actually thinking, not performing thought, but doing it. Then he said, "Do you want to explain the reasons?" She did. She told him everything. The binding ceremony, the East Corridor, the choice Kaylin had made, and why she believed he believed it was right, the road east in the dark, the 2 weeks she had spent not quite accepting what her body was already telling her. She told him all of it in the same way she always told him things, without embellishment, without performing emotions she was not having, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He will not be told," he said. "Not a question, just confirming." "No," she said. "And you are sure?" "I am sure," she said. "I have thought about it carefully. I am not making this decision from hurt, though I will admit the hurt is there. I am making it from logic. He made a deliberate choice, and I am going to allow it to stand." Aldrich looked at the map on the table, the careful lines of Solmir's southern boundary. She watched him think. "The child will need a home," he said. "I have a home," she said. "I am at the garrison." "The garrison is a posting," he said gently. "It is not a home in the full sense. A child needs more than a garrison barracks." He paused. "I am not telling you what to do. I am thinking out loud, the way you told me I am allowed to do." She almost smiled. "You are allowed," she said. "There is a house in the town," he said. "It has been empty since the previous southern administrator moved to the capital last year. It is a good house. 3 rooms, a garden, close to the market. It would be a reasonable place to raise a child." He paused again. "I can arrange for it to be made available." She looked at him. "Aldrich," she said. "You can decline," he said. "I am not pressing. I simply want the option to be on the table." She held his gaze and thought about what she knew of him, all the small and specific things she had accumulated over the winter months, the way he followed up, the way he sat with silence instead of filling it, the way he had told her about Cora, without making her feel like she needed to manage his grief for him, the way he asked if she was all right and accepted the actual answer. "Why?" she said. "The same question I asked you in the inn square." He thought about it honestly, the way he always did. "Because you are someone I have come to respect deeply," he said. "And because a child who is going to grow up in Solmir deserves to grow up with a stable home. And because," he paused, and something moved briefly across his face that was more open than his usual expression. Because I have been alone, in a large palace for 4 years, and I find that I am less interested in continuing to be alone than I once was. The last part was said quietly, not as a declaration, but as a fact he was sharing. The way he shared all facts, carefully and directly, and without making more of them than they were. She sat with it. "The house," she said. "I will think about the house." "Good," he said, and picked up his pen again. She took the house. She moved in 3 weeks later with her garrison bag and the pack law book she had never returned, and 2 additional books she had acquired since, and the small carved wooden box that her mother had given her the day she left the border clan to go to the binding ceremony. The house was as he had described it, 3 rooms and a garden and good bones and the pleasant particular smell of a house that has been well built and simply needs someone in it again. She arranged her things with the methodical efficiency she applied to everything, and then she stood in the main room in the afternoon light and felt the strangeness of having walls around her that were hers. Space that did not have the communal feel of the garrison. Quiet that was her own quiet. She sat down in the chair by the window. She put her hand over her stomach. The child was still a small thing, weeks away from the first movement she would be able to feel, but she pressed her hand there anyway, and let herself acknowledge it fully, this reality that was hers whether or not she had planned it, this small growing thing that was entirely without blame and entirely in need of her. She had not let herself be afraid. She had been too busy deciding things to be afraid. But sitting in the new quiet of her own house, she let the fear in briefly, just enough to know its shape. She was going to do this alone. She had no family nearby. Her kin had gone back to the border clan after seeing her safely to Solmir territory, and she was not going to contact them because the border clan would eventually send word to Ironmoon, and she was not ready for that chain of information to exist. She had friends at the garrison, colleagues she trusted, the gruff and solid company of Ellis who had said, upon hearing the news, "Well, you will need good boots and a reliable sleeping arrangement. Everything else is manageable," which was possibly the most Ellis thing that could have been said. She had Marin the healer. She had the house. She had Aldrich. That last one sat in a different category from the others. Not because she was certain about what it meant, but because she was honest enough with herself to know that it meant something. She thought about the way he had listened to her in the back room with the maps. She thought about the way he had not flinched from the information she gave him, had not backed away from it or become distant, or started calculating what it cost him. He had just thought about it, and then offered what he could offer. Kaelin had been so different. She did not want to compare them. Comparison felt like a reduction of something that was more complex than that, like trying to describe the difference between summer and winter by saying one was better than the other. But the comparison came anyway because it was the most available contrast, the thing she had to measure against because it was the only significant point of reference she had. Kaelin had felt the bond and then thought about what it would cost him. Aldrich had heard news that would have sent most men sideways and then thought about what she needed. The difference was not in character exactly. It was in the direction of the thinking, where Kaelin's thoughts had moved inward, toward self-protection and calculation, and the management of his own position. Aldrich's moved outward, toward the practical question of what was needed and how to provide it. She did not think Kaelin was a bad man. She had thought about this carefully, and she genuinely did not. He was a man who had been raised to believe that a king's first obligation was to his kingdom, and he had acted on that belief completely. The cost was paid by her, which was the problem, but the belief itself was not nothing. Kings who abandoned their political obligations for personal feeling sometimes caused great harm. She understood all of that. She still lived in this house. She still carried this child. Understanding a thing did not make its consequences smaller. The months moved through spring and into the heat of summer. Her body changed in the ways that bodies changed, and she adapted to the changes with the same practical attention she gave to everything. She continued her garrison work through the 4th month, lighter duties, tracking and paperwork and training the newer wolves on terrain reading, because Ellis had not asked her to stop working, and she had not offered to, and neither of them saw any reason why being pregnant should mean being idle. Aldrich came in May, which was early for a scheduled visit, and he brought with him a bundle of things that had clearly been assembled by someone who had consulted a list. A wool blanket in Solmir gray, a set of baby garments in various sizes because the exact timing of arrival was never quite certain, a book on the early development of wolf children that he said his advisors had found in the palace library, and a small carved wooden figure of a wolf in a running posture that he said had been in the palace nursery since his own childhood. He set these things on her kitchen table without ceremony. She looked at them for a moment. "You did not have to," she said. "I know," he said. She picked up the small carved wolf. It was smooth from years of handling, the wood worn down at the ears, and the tip of the tail, where generations of small hands had held it. She thought about what that meant, that he had gone into the nursery that had been empty for 4 years, and taken something out of it and brought it here. She did not say anything about that. She set the wolf carefully on the windowsill. "Thank you," she said. He looked at the windowsill. "How are you?" he said. "Getting larger," she said. "Otherwise functional." "I was not asking about the practicalities." She looked at him. "I know," she said. She thought about the honest answer. "I am doing well," she said. "Better than I expected. The work helps, the house helps, the healer is very good." A pause. "Your company helps." He was quiet for a moment. "I am glad," he said. She did not add anything to that, and neither did he, but the air between them held something that had been building all winter, something that was warm and patient, and had decided it was content to wait until both of them were ready. She was beginning to think she was getting ready. The first movement came in late June, a flutter so small that she almost misidentified it, and she was sitting at her kitchen table eating breakfast when it happened, and she put down her spoon, and pressed her hand to her side, and felt it happen again, the faintest possible interior gesture from the small person who was living inside her, and who had apparently decided to begin introducing themselves. She sat very still for a long time. She thought about the mate bond, which she had not pressed her attention against in weeks because she had been too busy for it, and she noticed that it did not hurt the way it used to. It ached, distantly, the way an old scar ached in cold weather, but it was not running anything. It was not making demands. She moved her hand over her stomach and said to the small person inside her, very quietly, "You are going to be all right. I am going to make absolutely sure." She meant it with her whole self. She made eggs, and ate them, and washed the plate, and went to work. Rylan came into the world on a November night, under a sky that had been throwing rain for 6 hours, and was still at it when the sun went down, and showed no intention of stopping. He arrived at the garrison infirmary because that was where Marin was, and Marin was where Sarah intended to be for this particular event, and he made his entrance with the decisive efficiency of a person who had somewhere to be, and intended to get there on schedule. Marin put him into Sarah's arms, and he looked up at her with the unfocused, intensely present gaze of a newborn who is taking in the world without yet having words for any of it. He had silver-gray eyes. She looked at them for a long time. She looked at the line of his jaw, which was going to be a strong jaw, and the shape of his brow, which was entirely Kaelin's, and the particular quality of the eyes, which had the pale wolf-silver shade that appeared in the Voss bloodline and nowhere else. She felt the mate bond pulse once, deeply, as if it had recognized something. Then she looked at her son, really looked at him, this person who was himself and no one else, who had arrived in the world owing nothing to anyone, except the life that was already entirely his, and she felt something so complete and so enormous that she had no name for it, and did not try to find one. "Hello," she said. He curled his hand around her finger with the grip of something that intended to hold on. There was a knock at the infirmary door. She said, "Come in." Aldrich stood in the doorway. He was in his travel coat, the wool one, with the road dust still on the shoulders, which meant he had ridden from somewhere and not stopped to change. He looked at her first to make sure she was all right, which she was. Then he looked at the baby. Something moved across his face that she had not seen before. It was very quiet and very deep. "May I come in?" he said. "Yes," she said. He came in. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the baby with the same direct attention he gave to everything, and the baby, in the manner of newborns everywhere, looked back at approximately the right area of the room without focusing on anything in particular. "He is very small," Aldrich said. "They always are at first," Sarah said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone who was doing something that mattered, he said, "May I hold him?" She looked at him. She thought about all the things he was. She thought about the packed nursery bundle he had brought in May. She thought about the small carved wolf on her windowsill. She thought about every careful and patient and honest thing he had been since a shepherd's hut in a rainstorm, when he had said, "Are you safe?" and she had not known how to answer. She held out her son. Aldrich took him with the careful reverence of someone who understood exactly the weight of what had been given to him. He held the baby with both hands, and looked down at him, and did not perform anything. No cooing, no theatrical warmth, just honest presence and careful hands. "Hello," he said quietly. Just as she had said. The rain hit the infirmary window in a steady, patient sheet. Sarah watched the two of them and felt the something that had been building all year settle into a shape she recognized, though she had no name for it yet, and was in no hurry to find one. She had time. For the first time, in a very long time, she had all the time she needed. 5 years had passed since Kalen Voss stood at the high tower window of Iron Moon Keep and watched the supply cart carry Sarah Ashvale through the eastern gate and into the pre-dawn dark. 5 years was enough time for a man to stop thinking about certain things. He had, in fact, largely stopped. He had become very skilled at it. The kingdom was still standing. That was what mattered. That was what he reminded himself. On the days when the mate bond ached in the specific way it sometimes did, when the weather was cold, and he was tired enough to let his guard down, Iron Moon was stable. The Northern Alliance was intact. Dagna was a capable queen who had made herself deeply respected in the court, by force of intelligence and organizational skill, which were considerable. There had been no wars, no significant uprisings, no catastrophic failures of the kind that undid kingdoms in the histories. He had made the right decision. He said that to himself less often now than he used to, which he took as a sign that he believed it more completely. The things you had to keep convincing yourself of were the things you doubted. He did not doubt this. He simply noted it, occasionally, in the quiet moments, the way you noted a scar, acknowledged it briefly, and moved on. The thing that he could not entirely move on from was the silence of his wolf. His wolf had not spoken to him in 5 years. Not properly. There had been moments, brief and half-formed, when he could feel the awareness at the edge of his mind that told him his wolf was present, but it never came fully forward, never offered the warm and certain companionship that had been the background of his life since childhood. His wolf had heard what happened in the East Corridor, and made its own decision, which was apparently to be very, very quiet about everything from that point forward. He had learned to function without it. He was a king. He had responsibilities that did not care about the condition of his relationship with his inner wolf. He showed up, he governed, he handled the endless tide of disputes and decisions and diplomatic letters that required responses, and his wolf sat in its corner and said nothing. Dagna had noticed. She had never said so directly, because Dagna was smart enough to know that saying so would not help, but he had caught her watching him sometimes with a look that was thoughtful and a little careful. The look of someone who understood that something was off balance, but had calculated that pointing it out would make it worse rather than better. She was right on both counts. He was off balance, and pointing it out would not help. The thing that brought it all forward again, sharply and without warning, was a courier's report. He read his courier reports every morning in his study, before anything else, because information was the foundation of good governance, and the foundation of information was processing it promptly and consistently. The reports came in from every corner of Iron Moon, and from the various observers he maintained in neighboring territories, because a king who only knew his own kingdom was a king who was always being surprised, and Kalen had a particular dislike of being surprised. The report that arrived on a Thursday morning in early autumn was from his observer in Solmir's southern town, a reliable man named Cowan, who had been sending reports for 3 years, and had never once sent anything inaccurate. Cowan's reports were typically about trade flows and border activity, and the general mood of the Solmir southern region. This report was about those things, and also about one other thing, which Cowan had included in the 3rd paragraph, as a piece of local news that might or might not be of interest to Iron Moon. The Alpha King of Solmir had been making more frequent visits to the southern garrison, and to the town nearby. This was notable because Solmir's king was known for the balance with which he distributed his time across the kingdom, and a shift in that pattern suggested something of personal significance had drawn his attention south. Cowan had asked around, carefully, in the way of a man who was good at asking around without appearing to be doing so. What he had found was that the king's visits had become regular approximately a year ago, around the time that a wolf from Iron Moon's border clan had taken a posting at the southern garrison, and subsequently moved into a house in the town. Her name, according to Cowan's report, was Sarah Ashvale. She had a child, a boy, approximately 14 months old at the time of the report. The child's name was Rylan. Kalen read the paragraph twice. He read it a third time. He set the report down on the desk with a very careful steadiness of hand that required more effort than it should have. His wolf, silent for 5 years, made a sound. It was not a word, and it was not quite a howl. It was something between the two, low and deep, and very close to the surface, as if it had been sitting just below the layer of silence all this time, and had been waiting for exactly this specific piece of information to break through. Kalen pressed both hands flat against the desk. He thought. The timing was exact. The timing was not possibly coincidental. 14 months, which meant the child had been born approximately 14 months ago, which meant the child had been conceived approximately 9 to 10 months before that. 9 to 10 months before 14 months ago. He did the arithmetic and arrived at a number that sat in his chest like something made of stone. He thought about the binding ceremony. He thought about the East Corridor. He thought about the supply cart in the Eastern Gate. He had not known. He had not been told. She had not told him. He tried to locate anger in himself about that and found it in exactly the wrong place, which was to say he found the anger pointing directly at himself instead of at her, because his mind was smart enough and honest enough to follow the logic to its source. She had not told him because she had calculated, accurately, that she owed him nothing. He had made a decision. He had made it clearly and finally, and she had understood it completely, and she had taken the consequences of his decision onto herself and walked east without asking him for anything, including this. He sat in his study with the courier report on the desk in front of him and let himself fully understand what he had done, possibly for the first time without the protective layer of political justification between himself and the reality of it. He had sent his mate away. She had been carrying his child. She had found shelter in a neighboring kingdom, safety, work, a home. She had built a life. She had done everything that needed to be done by herself, without him, and by all accounts she was doing it very well. And his son with the silver-gray eyes that Cowan had not mentioned, but that Kalen knew would be there, because the Voss bloodline ran true. His son was growing up in Solmere, with a Solmere king spending an increasing amount of time in the town where he lived. His wolf came up from its silence fully for the first time in 5 years, and it was not gentle about it. Kalen stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. He walked back to the desk. He walked to the window again. This was not something he typically did, this restless moving, because he was a man who governed his body with the same deliberate steadiness that he governed his kingdom, and restless pacing was not part of his presentation of himself. He did it anyway. His wolf pushed at him with the particular urgent language of a wolf that has had something taken from it that belongs to it, and he did not argue with it, because there was nothing to argue. The wolf was right. This was something that had been taken, or rather, something that had been given away, by him, deliberately, in the East Corridor, 5 years ago, and now it existed somewhere else, and was growing, and learning to speak and walk, and was being looked at, apparently, by Aldrich Solmere, with increasing frequency. He needed to think. He forced himself to stop pacing. He stood at the window, and looked out at the Iron Moon courtyard below, the familiar gray stone, and the winter bare trees, and the stable buildings across the way, and he breathed in through his nose, and out through his mouth, until his wolf settled from its surge, back into something more contained, though it did not go back to silence. He needed to think clearly, not react from the first wave of feeling. What were the facts? Fact 1. He had a son he had not known about. Fact 2. The son was in Solmere. Fact 3. His mate, who was not his mate in any formal sense because he had rejected the bond, though the bond itself did not seem to have received that information, was also in Solmere. Fact 4. The Solmere king was paying what appeared to be personal attention to both of them. He thought about what he knew of Aldrich Solmere. He had met the man only twice, at formal diplomatic events, and his impression had been of someone competent and measured and significantly harder to read than most people, which was either a diplomatic skill or a genuine quality of character, and Kalen had not been in his presence long enough to determine which. The reports from Solmir suggested a well-run kingdom, and a king who was respected by his people, which was the best basic indicator of a ruler's actual quality. He was taking care of Sarah. The phrase arrived in Kalen's mind, and sat there with an uncomfortable weight. He pushed it aside. He went back to the facts. He had a son. Everything else was context. The son was the center. He called Osric. Osric came promptly, as he always did, and stood in the study doorway with the careful attention of a man who had seen many moods in this king, and was assessing which one this was. He settled on careful within the first 5 seconds. "I need information about Solmir," Kalen said. "In particular?" Osric said. "There is a border clan wolf living in the southern town. She came from Ironmoon 5 years ago. She has a child." He paused. "I want to know everything that our observers know about that child, and about the Solmir king's relationship with both of them." Osric was very still for a moment. "My king," he said, "is this the woman from the binding ceremony?" "Yes," Kalen said. Another stillness. "And the child," Osric said carefully. "Is the child—" "Gather the information," Kalen said. "I will draw my own conclusions when I have it." Osric nodded once, and left without another word. Kalen stood alone in his study. The mate bond, which had been sitting in its bruised corner of his chest for 5 years without making significant demands, was now making itself very significantly felt. It was not the pleasant pull of the first night in the ceremony hall. It was something more urgent than that, the specific complaint of something that had been denied for a long time, and had received news that changed the calculation of everything. He walked back to the window. The courtyard below was going about its day, stable hands and guards and the kitchen staff moving between buildings with the purposeful efficiency of a well-run palace. None of them knew that the king at the window had just learned that his choices had a shape he had not been able to see from inside them, a shape that included a child with silver-gray eyes, living in a town in Solmir, and a foreign king, who had apparently understood exactly what was needed, and provided it without being asked. Dagna passed through the courtyard below, moving toward the east wing with her attendant, and she looked up at the window and their eyes met briefly, and she gave him the small nod that served as their shorthand for, "I see you, and I am nearby," the particular language of two people who had built a real working partnership without the heat of love in it. He did not deserve her either, not entirely. She had come to Ironmoon in good faith, and built herself a place here with real skill and real intelligence, and she had never once pretended that what they had was something it was not, and he had received all of that without giving her the full attention it deserved, because he had been too busy managing the absence of what he had turned away. He thought about Rylan. He had a son named Rylan. He did not know what the boy looked like beyond the eyes he was imagining. He did not know his voice or his laugh or whether he was the kind of child who woke early or slept late. He did not know if he liked running or climbing or sitting still with a book. He did not know anything about this person who was half his blood and entirely unknown to him. 5 years of not knowing. He had made a decision in the East Corridor, and he had been so certain of it, so disciplined in maintaining his certainty, that it had not until this moment fully landed in him what that certainty had cost. He turned away from the window. He could not undo 5 years. That was a simple fact, and grief about it was not going to change it. What he could do was decide what to do from here. He sat back down at his desk. He put the courier report to one side and took a piece of fresh paper from the drawer and picked up his pen. He wrote for a long time, slowly and carefully, thinking through every word before he committed it to the page. He wrote out the full problem and all of its dimensions, the political, the personal, the practical, the question of what he owed and to whom and in what order. He wrote about Dagna and Ironmoon and the Northern Alliance and the mate bond and the son he had never met and the woman who had not told him because she had understood, accurately, that she did not have to. He wrote until his hand ached. Then he read everything he had written. He sat with it for a long time. Outside his window, the first snow of autumn began to fall on Ironmoon, small and tentative and barely visible, the way the first snow of the season always was, as if the winter were checking to make sure it was welcome, before committing to the full cold. He watched it fall. His wolf watched with him, awake now, quiet but awake, which was different from the 5-year silence, in a way that Kalen could not have explained exactly, but felt in the way you felt the difference between a room with no one in it and a room with one very still person in the corner. He picked up his pen again. He began a different letter. This one was addressed to the office of the Solmere court, formally requesting that a diplomatic summit be arranged between the two kingdoms at the earliest available date. The language was precise and correct, and gave no indication of the weight behind it. The reasons cited were the Brackwall border situation and the ongoing trade discussions and the general maintenance of good relations between neighboring kingdoms. All of those things were real reasons. They were not the main reason. He sealed the letter. He called for a rider. He sent it. Then he sat for a long time in his study, while the snow fell on Iron Moon, and his wolf breathed quietly in the new warmth of its returned wakefulness, and he thought about a boy with silver-gray eyes who did not know who he was. The diplomatic summit was held in the great hall of Solmere Palace on a clear morning in late spring, 6 months after Kalen Voss had sent his formal request and received a formal response from Aldrich's court. And during those 6 months, Kalen had thought about this day in approximately the same way a person thinks about a difficult conversation they have scheduled with someone they owe a debt to. Constantly. With the specific quality of anticipation that is not excitement but is too urgent to be simply dread. He rode into Solmere with a delegation of 12, which was the appropriate size for a cross-kingdom diplomatic visit, and which meant he had 12 people with him, who were all watching how he handled himself, and none of whom he could tell any of what was actually happening in his chest. The Solmere court was not what he expected, though he should have expected it, given the reports. It was quieter than Iron Moon, less formal in its architecture, but somehow more authoritative, in the way of places whose confidence did not need to announce itself. The stone was warmer in color. The staff moved efficiently, and without visible anxiety, which was a sign of good management from the top. The guards at the entrance were attentive, without being aggressive. He was received by Aldrich's chief steward, a precise and pleasant man, who showed the Iron Moon delegation to their chambers, and gave them an hour to settle before the formal reception. Kalen used the hour to sit in the chair by the window of his guest chambers, and look out at the Solmere courtyard below, and prepare himself in the way he prepared for difficult things, which was to identify exactly what he was feeling, acknowledge it completely, and then set it to one side, where it would not be running anything. He was feeling the mate bond. He had been feeling it with increasing intensity since entering Solmere territory, which made sense because the mate bond oriented toward its counterpart, and the counterpart was somewhere in this kingdom. It had been pulling at him with gentle but persistent insistence since he crossed the border, a compass needle finding north. He set it to one side. He dressed in the formal clothes his attendant laid out for him, dark and well cut in the Iron Moon style, and he went down to the great hall for the reception. Aldrich was already in the hall with his advisors when Kalen arrived. He was taller than Kalen remembered from their 2 previous meetings, or perhaps just more present, filling the space with the particular quiet authority of someone who did not need rooms to announce him. He crossed the floor to greet the Iron Moon delegation, with the ease of a man on his own territory who had nothing to prove. They shook hands. "King Voss," Aldrich said, "welcome to Solmere. I hope the ride was reasonable." "Excellent roads," Kalen said. "Your cartographers did good work on the southern passes." "We had an exceptional consultant," Aldrich said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite a smile but was related to one. Kalen did not know what that meant yet. He filed it. The reception moved through the correct stages: introductions, light food, the formal exchange of the documents that would anchor the summit discussions, the careful social architecture of 2 kingdoms, taking each other's measure through the medium of polite conversation. Kalen was good at this. He had done it 100 times. He could hold a diplomatic conversation on one level of his mind, while using another level for something else entirely. And today, the something else entirely was the fact that somewhere in this palace, or this town, Sarah Ashvale was going about her day with a child who had his eyes. He was still running that calculation when the doors at the far end of the hall opened. He did not see Sarah first. He saw the boy. The child ran in through the far doors the way small children ran everywhere, with the whole-body commitment of someone whose legs had recently figured out what they were for and was not wasting any opportunity to use them. He was perhaps 4, perhaps 5, small but solid, with dark hair that was already pushing out of whatever shape someone had put it in that morning, and a look of absolute determination on his face that was directed entirely at the adult he was running toward. He crashed into Aldrich's legs. Aldrich put his hand on the boy's head, without interrupting his conversation with the Solmere trade minister, the casual gesture of someone so accustomed to this particular small person that he no longer had to think about accommodating him. The boy pressed his face against Aldrich's side for a moment, then looked up at all the unfamiliar faces in the room, with the frank assessment of a child who had been around enough people to be comfortable with new ones. His eyes were silver gray, pale and steady, and exactly the color that Kalen saw every morning when he looked in the mirror. The Voss gray, unmistakable, the trait that ran through his bloodline so consistently that his grandmother had said it was the family's signature written in their faces. Kalen's wolf hit the surface of him like something breaking through ice. He had been braced. He had thought he was braced, but the reality of looking at those eyes in a child's face, this small, solid, entirely real person, with his dark hair going sideways, and his hand fisted in the fabric of Aldrich's jacket, was entirely different from having been braced for it. He stood very still. He was good at standing still. He was excellent at it. He used every one of those years of practice right now, keeping his face composed, keeping his posture steady, not letting any of what was moving through him get past the surface. Aldrich looked down at the boy. "Rylan," he said, "you were supposed to stay with Marta until after the reception." "Marta said 10 more minutes," the boy said, "but I counted wrong." "Marta usually means it literally," Aldrich said. "I know," said Rylan, without any apparent guilt about this. The name landed in Kalen's ears and settled in his chest with a weight he was not expecting. Rylan. He had not known the name until the courier report. He had been saying it in his mind for 6 months, and now it was being said out loud by the boy's own voice. The boy's own ordinary, unself-conscious voice, and it was unbearably specific. Rylan looked up at Kalen. Children were more direct than adults. They had not yet learned to look away from things they were looking at, or to dress their attention in social acceptability. He looked at Kalen with the open, uninflected assessment of someone trying to figure out who a new person was and where they fit. Kalen looked back at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. His wolf, which had broken through the ice of 5 years of silence, was not quiet. It recognized what it was looking at with the absolute certainty of something that ran deeper than thought or decision, the recognition that came from blood and bond, and the fundamental animal knowledge that this was his, this small person with the silver-gray eyes and the dark hair, and the slight smudge on his left cheek that had probably come from the garden, or the stables or whatever interesting place he had been before deciding to count wrong. "His name is Rylan," Aldrich said beside him, with a careful neutrality that told Kalen, sharply and precisely, that Aldrich understood exactly who Kalen was, and had already decided how to handle this moment. "Hello," Kalen said to the boy. He said it as naturally as he could, which took a great deal. "Hello," Rylan said. He had a slightly formal way of speaking that came, Kalen suspected, from spending time around adults who were formal. He did not seem intimidated by Kalen, the way some children were by adults they did not know. He looked at him and then said, "You have the same eyes as me." The hall was not entirely quiet. The reception was still happening around them, but in Kalen's experience of the moment, the sound had gone down to something far away and irrelevant. "Do I?" he said. "They are the same color," Rylan said, with the matter-of-fact interest of someone who had noticed something interesting and was reporting it. "Gray. Most people have brown eyes, or dark eyes. Mine are gray. Mama says they are unusual." "They are unusual," Kalen agreed, and the word came out with a texture he could hear in it, even if no one else could. Rylan considered him for another moment, then apparently decided he had been assessed sufficiently, and turned back to Aldrich. "Can I have some of those?" He pointed at the table of light food along the wall. "2 pieces, Aldrich said, "and then you go back to Marta. 4 pieces. 3. Final offer." "All right," Rylan said, with the particular tone of someone accepting a negotiation they are privately satisfied with. He went toward the food table, with the directness of a child on a mission. Kalen watched him go. He was aware, after a moment, that Aldrich was watching him. He turned to meet the amber eyes. Aldrich held his gaze with a steadiness that was entirely unperformative. There was nothing challenging in it, nothing triumphant, nothing that could be called a display of possession or a provocation. It was simply a man who knew exactly what was happening, and had decided that the most honest response to it was to look at it directly. "He is a remarkable child," Aldrich said. Kalen said nothing. "Intelligent," Aldrich continued. "Curious about everything. He already knows the names of every bird in the southern hills and the tracking patterns of the deer that come through the garrison woodland. He will be a very strong wolf when he shifts." A pause. "He is loved. He wants for nothing." Each sentence landed in Kalen with a specific weight. He looked at Aldrich and understood, in this moment, something that the courier reports and the 6 months of preparation had not quite conveyed, which was that Aldrich Solmere was not a man who did things partially. He had not simply given Sarah a place to live, and food to eat, and an opportunity to work. He had given this child a father's attention, the specific, consistent, deeply engaged attention that only came from someone who had made a genuine choice to be present. He had done this for 4 years. He had done it without being asked, and without being compensated, and without knowing for certain, until now, whether the man who had made it all necessary would ever appear in the same room with him. Kalen said, after a long moment, "You have been very good to them." It was not what a king typically said in the middle of a formal reception, but it was what was true. Aldrich looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said, not with pride, or with the particular satisfaction of a man who wanted to be acknowledged for his goodness. Just a simple confirmation. "She did not tell me," Kalen said. "No," Aldrich said. "She decided not to. Do you understand why?" Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "I understand that she believed your decision in Iron Moon was complete," he said, "and that she was honoring it by not adding to the weight of it." Kalen felt that sentence the way you felt something that was both accurate and painful, which was to say fully. "That was not a small thing to do," he said. "No," Aldrich said, "it was not. She is not someone who does things by halves." Across the hall, Rylan was carefully choosing his 3 pieces from the food table, with the focused seriousness of someone maximizing a negotiated resource. He looked up and caught Kalen looking at him, and he looked back without shyness for a moment, and then he went back to the food table. "What do you intend?" Aldrich said. Kalen looked at him. "To handle this with the same care it deserves," he said, "however long that takes." Aldrich held his gaze for one more moment, then he nodded, once, and moved on to speak with the Solmere trade minister, and the reception continued around them in its correct and organized way. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later. She came in from the side entrance, which was the entrance from the residential wing, and she was dressed in the Solmere gray that Kalen recognized from the garrison reports. Not court dress, but working dress, and she was clearly not expecting the reception to still be in progress, because she stopped just inside the door, and took in the room with the quick, assessing sweep of someone who was recalibrating. She found Kalen in approximately 2 seconds. He knew she found him because the room had not changed, and she had, very slightly, in a way that no one else would have noticed. Her chin came up a fraction of an inch, her shoulders settled, not stiffening, exactly, more like a person squaring to a task. Then she walked into the room. She was 4 years more than he remembered. Not older in the way of someone worn down, but more settled, more herself, the way a piece of wood became more itself when it had been properly cured. She was comfortable in her body in a way she had not been in the East Corridor, which made sense, because in the East Corridor she had been dealing with news that had just been delivered by someone who was about to walk away. She was not dealing with news now. She was dealing with something she had been the one to decide about, which was an entirely different thing. She crossed the room toward Aldrich and stopped near him, and said something quietly that Kalen could not hear, and Aldrich said something back, and her expression shifted slightly, a subtle acknowledgement. Then she looked at Kalen. They had not spoken in 5 years. They had not been in the same room in 5 years. The mate bond, which had been pulling at him since he crossed the Solmere border, hit the wall of her actual presence, and did what a compass needle did when it found true north. He walked toward her. She did not move toward him, but she did not step back either. She stood and let him come, and when he stopped, an appropriate distance from her, she met his eyes with the same clear, steady gray-green gaze that he had never quite been able to stop carrying in the back of his mind, even when he was being most disciplined about not thinking about it. "Kalen," she said. Her voice was exactly as he remembered it, lower than expected, steady. The hall moved around them. People talked. Glasses were lifted. The reception happened. In the center of it, two people stood and looked at each other across 5 years of very specific choices. "The boy," Kalen said, and then stopped, because he did not know what sentence came after that. "His name is Rylan," she said. "I know," he said. "I know his name." She held his gaze. She did not offer anything more. She was waiting, he understood, to see what he was going to do, whether he was going to make demands or accusations or diplomatic maneuvers, whether he was going to reach for the political machinery of kingship and apply it to this personal situation in the way he had applied it before. He said, carefully, and with more honesty than he typically allowed himself in public, "I was not prepared for him." Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, very slightly. "No," she said, "I did not imagine you would be. He looks like me." "Yes," she said. "He does not know," Kalen said. "He is 4, she said. "He knows what a 4-year-old needs to know. He knows he is loved. He knows his home. He knows Aldrich." The last word landed between them with a weight that neither of them pretended it did not have. Kalen said, after a moment, "He is good to him." Something moved across Sarah's face that was not quite approval and not quite warning. Something more complex than either. "He is extraordinary to him," she said, "in every specific way that matters. Every day, for 4 years. Without being asked, without requiring anything in return, without ever once making Rylan feel that being loved by him was conditional. Each sentence was quiet. Each sentence was precise. She was not angry, he realized. She was being accurate, which was a particular kind of difficult to receive. "I understand," he said. "I hope so," she said. "I genuinely do." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then looked across the hall, to where Rylan was now being guided by someone back toward the side entrance, presumably Marta, returning to collect him. Rylan went without complaint, stopping once to look back at the hall with an expression of thorough satisfaction at having successfully negotiated his 3 pieces and his unauthorized early arrival. Sarah watched him go with the look that parents had when they watched their children leave a room, that specific combination of love and worry and quiet wonder at the fact of them. Then she looked back at Kalen. "He has your eyes," she said. "He has your jaw. He shifts early for his age, which is a Voss trait, from what I have read. He is very smart and very stubborn, which may come from either of us." A pause. "He is his own person. Whatever happens in this summit, and after it, he is his own person first." "I know that," Kalen said. "Good," she said. She moved away, back toward Aldrich, and Kalen watched her go the way he had watched her go in the East Corridor 5 years ago, which was to say with a feeling in his chest that had many names, and none of them simple. His wolf, awake and aching, watched beside him. Aldrich Solmir had known for 3 years. Not as a guess, and not as a suspicion, but as a confirmed fact, the kind of fact that arrived with the specific quality of certainty that came from a bloodline signature that did not lie. He had known from the morning after Rylan's first shift, when he had stood in the eastern yard of the palace, watching the small gray wolf run its first tentative loops through the grass, and had recognized, in the particular color and carriage of the animal, something he had read about in the same pack law texts that Sarah had worked her way through in the garrison library. The Voss wolf was silver gray in a specific way, a pale gray, with a deep undertone that read almost blue in certain light, and it was historically significant because it had not appeared outside the direct Voss bloodline in documented record. He had read that in a genealogy of the great pack families that he kept in his personal collection. He had read it before Rylan shifted, actually, filed it away as an interesting historical detail, the way he filed many interesting historical details. When Rylan shifted and the gray came in around him like early morning light, Aldrich had looked at it and known. He had stood in the yard and thought for a long time, and what he had thought was, what does knowing this change? He had arrived, after considerable time, at his answer. It changed nothing that mattered. Rylan was Rylan. He had been Rylan since the rain-soaked November night when he had arrived in the garrison infirmary and wrapped his hand around Aldrich's finger and looked at the world with the unfocused, present intensity of a person meeting everything for the first time. Aldrich had made his decision that night, quietly and without drama, in the way he made most important decisions, by simply understanding what was true and acting from it. What was true was that this child was going to need someone who showed up consistently and without reservation, and that Aldrich was present and capable, and had more room in his life for that than he had previously understood. He had shown up. 4 years of showing up. 4 years of the specific and unremarkable and completely irreplaceable accumulation of small moments that became, over time, the texture of a life lived alongside someone. He had been there for the first steps and the first words, and the first time Rylan had fallen off the garrison paddock fence and cried, not from the falling, but from the affront of having fallen, the particular outrage of a child who had not yet accepted that bodies sometimes failed their intentions. He had been there for the fever that came in the second winter, the 3 nights when Rylan ran hot and restless, and Sarah slept sitting up in the chair beside his bed, with her hand on his chest, and Aldrich had arrived on the second night with food she had not eaten, and had sat on the other side of the bed, and not left until the morning of the third day, when the fever finally broke, and Rylan opened his eyes, and immediately asked for bread with honey. He had been there for the books, of which there were many, because Rylan had his mother's appetite for information, and his father's focus, though Aldrich only privately attributed the second thing to the man who had supplied half the boy's inheritance. He had read aloud for hours, first the simple books and then the more complex ones, the histories and the natural records and eventually the pack law texts that Rylan approached with the seriousness of a scholar. He had been there. That was the whole of it. He had been there, and in being there consistently, day after day and year after year, he had become the person Rylan reached for when something happened that required an adult. He had become, in every functional and meaningful sense of the word, the thing the boy needed him to be. He was not Rylan's biological father. He understood that. He had never pretended otherwise, though the question had not come up yet, because Rylan had not asked it yet, being the kind of 4-year-old who was deeply interested in the world around him, and not yet deeply interested in his own origin story, which was a mercy that Aldrich was grateful for, because it meant the telling of that story could happen at the right time, rather than a pressured one. He had discussed the telling of it with Sarah, quietly and carefully, several times. They had agreed on the broad shape of it, that Rylan deserved to know everything true, that he would be told at an age when he could actually understand it, that the telling would be done with love and without making him feel responsible for anything that had happened between adults. They had not agreed on an exact timeline, because exact timelines for things like this were difficult to set, because children developed at their own pace, and readiness was not a calendar event. They had been working toward it. And then the diplomatic summit had arrived. Aldrich had known it was coming for 6 months, since the formal request arrived from Iron Moon. He had known what Kalen Voss was actually coming for, though the official reasons listed were genuine enough, and the trade discussions would be substantive, and the Brackwall border situation was real and worth addressing. He had known because he had been monitoring Iron Moon carefully since the binding ceremony incident, which he had known about before Sarah told him, because he kept careful records on his neighboring kingdoms, and because a bond rejection at a public ceremony between a sitting Alpha King and a border clan wolf was the kind of event that appeared in the intelligence reports whether or not anyone intended it to. He had prepared for the summit the way he prepared for difficult things, which was to think through all the dimensions and identify the most honest possible position and hold it. His position was simple. Rylan was his son in the way that mattered. Anyone who wished to contest that was welcome to do so in front of the people who would actually decide the question, which were Rylan himself, when he was old enough, and Sarah, who had been the one to carry and birth and raise this child, and whose authority over his life was absolute. His position was not aggressive. He was not going to pick a fight with Kalen Voss, or make claims that required defense. He simply had the facts as they were, and the facts were clear, and he trusted that clarity was a better foundation than any maneuvering. On the evening of the first day of the summit, after the reception had ended and the delegations had retired and Rylan had been put to bed by Sarah in the rooms they kept at the palace during their visits, Aldrich sat in his private study and thought about the meeting with Kalen. He had not hated the man. He had expected to feel something sharp and defensive when he finally met him in person, expected some version of the animal territorial response that would have been natural given the situation. He had not felt it. Or rather, he had felt something much more complex than that, something that required him to actually look at Kalen Voss and assess what he saw, rather than arriving with a judgment already made. What he saw was a man in significant pain who was trying very hard not to show it. He could see it in the stillness Kalen used, the particular quality of controlled steadiness that came not from actual calm, but from someone holding themselves together by their own discipline. He had seen it in the way the man looked at Rylan, not with the aggression of possession, but with something that was closer to grief than anything else, the grief of someone encountering a loss they had not understood they were experiencing. He had also seen someone genuinely trying to be careful, not just strategically careful, though that was there too, but careful in the actual sense, the sense of not wanting to do more harm. That did not resolve anything. Being careful now did not undo 5 years of absence. But Aldrich was a fair-minded person, and fairness required him to acknowledge it. He thought about Sarah. He had spent 4 years thinking about Sarah, in the way that you thought about a person you had been watching arrive at themselves. She had come into his kingdom damaged, not in a way that was visible from the outside, because she was too capable and too disciplined to let damage be visible, but in the particular interior way of someone whose foundational belief in what they deserved had taken a significant blow. She had believed, at the deepest level, that she was worth less than a political alliance. Someone had told her that, not in words but in actions, which were more convincing than words. He had spent 4 years offering her the counter-evidence. Not deliberately, not as a campaign. He was not a man who managed his relationship strategically. He had simply behaved toward her the way he behaved toward things he found genuinely valuable, which was with full attention and consistent honesty, and the kind of care that showed up without requiring acknowledgement. He watched her rebuild. He watched her believe, incrementally, and with the careful pace of someone who had been taught to distrust their own instincts, that she was someone worth being present for. He watched her do it without anyone's permission or encouragement, just from the inside, from the quiet accumulation of evidence that the world she was living in now was different from the one she had come from. He loved her. He had known this with increasing certainty since the second winter, though he had not said it out loud, because saying it out loud required him to be sure that she was ready to hear it, and Sarah's readiness was not a thing he was going to rush for his own comfort. She had a son who needed her full attention, and a past that required patience, and a future that she was building carefully, and he was not going to arrive in the middle of all of that and make his feelings something she had to manage. He waited. He had become very good at waiting. He had been waiting since Cora died, in a different way, waiting for the point at which grief changed shape enough to let something else be possible. The waiting had been its own education. The evening after the reception, he went to find Sarah. She was in the garden at the back of the palace, the small one that had been her preference since the first visit long enough ago that it had stopped feeling like a palace garden and started feeling like hers. She was sitting on the stone bench near the east wall with a cup of something warm in her hands, and her face doing what her face did when she was thinking, that slight stillness that was different from her ordinary resting expression, more interior. He sat on the bench beside her. The evening was warm. The last light was on the garden wall, the particular gold of late spring at the end of the day. "He is not what I expected," she said, without preamble. "What did you expect?" She thought about it. "Larger," she said, "in the way that people get larger in your memory when you have been angry at them. Or not angry exactly. I was not angry at him, I do not think. But I had been carrying him in a certain shape, and the actual shape is different. Is that good or bad?" Aldrich said. She was quiet for a moment. "I am not sure it is either. It is just different." A pause. "He is in pain." "Yes," Aldrich said. He saw Rylan. "Yes." She turned her cup in her hands. The steam was going vertical in the still air. He looked at him, the way you look at something you have spent a long time convincing yourself you did not want, and then see for the first time, and understand that you were wrong. Aldrich was quiet, letting her think. "I do not know what to do with that," she said. "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "It is his to do something with. Your job is to know what you want, and to protect Rylan from anything that is not good for him." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and held what he was feeling, with the discipline of a man who knew this was not the moment, that the conversation she needed right now was not the one that was most available to him personally. He was not going to introduce his feelings into this space when she had just spent a day managing a situation that was already demanding everything she had. The council is going to say something about Rylan, she said. Probably, he said. There are members of my court who are aware of the timeline and the bloodline connection. There are members of the Iron Moon delegation who will have done the arithmetic. They will try to make it a political question. They will try, he agreed. I will manage what I can manage, but you should know it is coming. She was quiet for a long time. The garden darkened around them as the last light moved off the wall. Rylan does not know, she said. We have been waiting. I have been waiting. And now he might find out from something happening around him, rather than from me telling him directly. She pressed her lips together. I do not want that. Then we should tell him before it becomes something that happens to him, Aldrich said. Before the summit ends? Before the summit ends, he said, while you have control of the shape of it. She nodded slowly. Yes, she said, that is right. They sat in the garden in the dark, not talking, which was something they did well together, and after a long time Sarah said, quietly, thank you. For today, for being there. I am always there, he said, simply. She turned to look at him. The garden was very dark now, lit only by the lights from the palace windows that came through the archway behind them, and made everything warm and slightly imprecise. He could see her face, the steadiness of it, the specific quality of attention she was giving him that was the particular attention she gave to things she was genuinely thinking about. I know, she said. I have been noticing that for a while. He held her gaze. There were things he could say. He chose not to say them yet. Not tonight. Not in the middle of all of this. He filed them carefully for later. Go and check on Rylan, he said. He will have put himself to sleep with a book, and it will be resting on his face. She almost smiled. He does that. I know, he said. I have been noticing that for a while too. She went inside. He stayed in the garden for a long time, thinking about the summit, and about Kalen Voss, and about the particular difficulty of being a fair person, in a situation that would have been much simpler if he were less fair. He thought about what Kalen was. He had seen it in the hall, beneath the pain and the control, a man who was capable of doing the right thing, who had the intelligence and the self-awareness required for it, but who had made a decision 5 years ago from the wrong part of himself, and was now living in the exact shape of that choice. He was not a villain. Villains were easier. He was a person who had been wrong in a specific way at a specific moment, and the question of what happened next was not simple. Aldrich was not afraid of the complication. He had 4 years of being Rylan's father, and he was not going to let anyone take that quietly, not even someone with a legitimate biological claim. But he was also not going to pretend that a child did not deserve to know where he came from, or that a man who was genuinely trying to correct a wrong should be prevented from doing so entirely. He was going to trust Sarah to know what she wanted. And he was going to trust Rylan to be, as he always was, someone with a remarkably clear sense of what he needed. The rest would sort itself out. He was good at waiting for things to sort themselves out. He had learned it from a woman who had walked through his kingdom in a rainstorm with a sprained ankle and her head up and not asked anyone for anything she had not earned, and that was possibly the most useful thing anyone had ever taught him. He went inside. He found, as he had predicted, the book resting on Rylan's face. He took it off carefully and put it on the nightstand and looked at the child who was his, in every way that mattered, breathing the deep, untroubled breathing of someone whose sleep was uncontested, and he thought that whatever happened in the summit and after it, this was the thing he was not going to lose. He was sure of that, with the specific sureness of someone who had done the work to earn being sure. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. Sarah found Kalen in the east courtyard on the second morning of the summit. She had not gone looking for him, not precisely, but she had known he would be there because the east courtyard had been his chosen space since the delegation arrived, the only outdoor area of the palace that faced toward Iron Moon, which she noted and did not comment on. He stood at the low stone wall at the courtyard's edge, looking out at the hills, and he heard her coming the way wolves heard everything, with a whole-body attentiveness that was impossible to suppress. He turned before she reached him. She walked to the wall and stopped beside him. Not adjacent, but close, with a foot or two of stone between them, and looked out at the same hills he had been looking at. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I was going to find you today, he said. I saved you the effort, she said. She had been deciding what she wanted to say to him since the reception ended, and she had not arrived at anything clean and prepared. She had decided, finally, to say what was true, and let it have the shape it had, and stop trying to arrange it into something more manageable. "You want to talk about Rylan," she said. "Yes," he said. "Then I will talk about Rylan," she said. "And while I do, I need you to only listen, not respond, not plan, not calculate. Listen." He turned to face her. "Yes," he said. She looked at the hills and said what was true. She told him about the night Rylan was born, the rain, and the garrison infirmary, and the small hand around her finger. She told him about the first year, the way Rylan had learned the garrison wolves by their scents before he could say their names, the way he had grown up knowing without question that the world was a place that contained good people and interesting things. She told him about the fever in the second winter, and the nights she had not slept, and the morning the fever broke, and Aldrich had been there, his coat still on from the previous evening, because he had not gone home. She told him about the first shift, the early morning yard, and the gray wolf running its first loops through the grass, and Rylan's face when he shifted back. This absolute, incandescent shock and delight at having discovered he was something larger than he had known. She told him about the books and the tracking lessons, and the negotiation over 3 pieces of food at receptions, which she had watched from the doorway, and which had cost her enormous effort not to laugh at. She told him all of it, the specific accumulation of 4 years, because she wanted him to understand not just that Rylan was well, but what well looked like in detail, so that there was no room for a vague reassurance to settle in place of the real thing. She did not want him reassured. She wanted him to know exactly what he had missed, and exactly how full what he had missed was. When she finished, the courtyard was very quiet. Kalen stood with his hands on the wall and said nothing for a long time. She looked at him sideways and saw that he was not holding himself together through discipline in the way he had at the reception. Something had shifted. He was still, but it was not the controlled stillness of a man managing himself. It was the stillness of someone who had been fully reached by something and was simply staying inside it. She had not expected that. "She did not tell me until Martin found your name in the courier report," she said. He looked at her. "I mean that. When I made the decision not to contact you, I did not do it from anger. I did not do it from a wish to hurt you. I did it because you had made a decision and I was going to respect it, and because everything Rylan needed I was able to provide without involving you, and because," she paused, "because I was not going to have him grow up feeling like something that needed to be managed, a complication in someone else's life. He deserved better than that." "Yes," Kalen said. His voice was low and steady, and carried something that was not quite raw, but was close. "He does not know about you," she said. "I have been planning to tell him. I will tell him. I will tell him everything that is true, in a way he can understand at his age." "When?" Kalen said. "Before the summit ends," she said, "while I am the one telling him, in a way I can control, so he finds out from me, and not from something that happens around him." He looked at her carefully. "What will you tell him?" She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since the moment she saw Kalen cross the threshold of the Solmere Great Hall. "I will tell him that there was a man in another kingdom who was my mate, who did not know I was carrying him, and who is here now for a visit." She paused. "That is true. It does not put blame anywhere, and it does not require him to feel anything in particular about it. He is 4. He will have questions, and I will answer the questions as they come." Kalen was quiet. "He will have questions about you," she said, "eventually. When he is older and the concept of fathers is more concrete to him, and I will answer those honestly too. Including the part where I sent you away," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." He held her gaze, and did not flinch from it. "That is fair," he said. "More than fair." She looked back at the hills. The morning had warmed while they were talking, the sun coming off the hills in a way that turned the grass from dark green to a lighter gold, and a hawk was turning slow circles over the ridge to the east, something she had watched it do before, and suspected it did every morning from habit. "I need to say something to you," Kalen said. She waited. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone organizing something that required precision. "I have spent 5 years telling myself that the decision I made was right," he said. "And I have been disciplined about it, because discipline was what I had available, and doubt was not something I could afford to carry in a court where certainty was required. But I have known, underneath all of it, that what I did in that corridor was not simply a king making a hard choice. It was also a man choosing safety over something real. I chose the path with no risk in it, and I dressed it in the language of duty, so it would be easier to live inside. She did not say anything. I am not asking for forgiveness, he said. I am not offering this as an apology you are required to accept. I am telling you what is true, because I have been in this kingdom for 2 days, and the things that are true here are very clear, and being next to that clarity has made me unable to continue not saying this. She thought about the east corridor, the torchlight, his face, even then, the genuine quality of his apology, and the equally genuine quality of his decision underneath it. I know, she said. He looked at her. I knew in the corridor, she said. I understood that you were being honest with me, and still choosing the other thing. That is its own particular kind of hard thing to be on the receiving end of. Yes, he said. I imagine it is. I do not need you to explain yourself to me, she said. I figured it out. I had 5 years to work through the understanding of it, and I did. And I have come out the other side of that, into a life that I am genuinely glad to be living. She paused. What I need from you, the only thing I need from you, is to handle whatever comes next, with the same care you just showed me in the last 2 minutes. That is what I need from you as Ryland's father. The word landed between them. She had used it deliberately, without softening it. His jaw moved slightly, the smallest tightening, and then released. I want to know him, he said. Not to take anything from Aldrich, who has earned every single thing Ryland gives him, I can see that clearly. But to know him, to be someone real to him, in whatever way is right for him. She looked at him. That is not mine to give, she said. That is Ryland's. He is the one who decides who he lets in and who he trusts. I can tell him the truth, and I cannot stand in the way, and I can make sure nothing frightens him. But whether he wants to know you is entirely up to him. She could see him accept it. And the mate bond, he said, carefully. She looked at the hills again. The hawk had settled on the ridge now, folding its wings with the satisfied precision of something that had finished what it came to do. The bond is what it is, she said. It has been what it is for 5 years. It does not rule anything for me anymore. It is there. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But it does not run my days or my decisions. It does not tell me what to do. A pause. My life is here. Aldrich is in my life, in a way that matters deeply. Ryland is Ryland, and he belongs first to himself, and then to the people who have shown up for him. Those are the facts, as they exist right now. He looked at her for a long moment. He loves you, Kaelin said. It was not a question, and it was not an accusation. It was a simple observation. Yes, she said, and I am working toward deserving that. You deserve it already, Kaelin said. Any honest person looking at what you have done in 5 years can see that. She was quiet. I am not trying to take anything, he said. I want you to know that. I came here because I needed to see what I had done, and what existed now, and I have seen it, and I am not going to try to undo it. What exists now is good. It is better than what I could have built if I had made a different choice, because I did not have whatever Aldrich has, this specific quality of just showing up entirely, and Ryland deserved someone who had it. She turned to look at him fully. He met her eyes. That is the most honest thing you have said to me, she said. It is the most honest thing I have said to myself in 5 years, he said. It is easier to say it out loud than I expected. She thought about that. Good, she said. Not warmly, not coldly. Simply. Hold on to that. Whatever happens with the council and the political questions and the bloodline discussions, hold on to that and use it as your compass. Yes, he said. She pushed off from the wall. I am going to tell Ryland tonight, she said. After supper, when he is settled and not tired. Would you be willing to meet him tomorrow, briefly, without agenda, without any of the adults around him making it into a significant occasion? He looked at her with something that was very close to gratitude. Yes, he said. Whatever you think is right. She nodded. She walked back across the courtyard toward the palace entrance, and behind her she heard him stay at the wall, not following, not calling after her, simply standing where he was, and letting her go, which was the thing she had not gotten from him 5 years ago, and which now, here, he finally managed. It was too late for it to mean what it would have meant then. But it was not nothing. She went inside and found Rylan in the palace library, where he had migrated from his morning lesson, stretched out on the large reading chair, with a book on birds of the southern hills open on his chest, and his face turned up toward the light from the high windows. He heard her come in and did not look up. "I was reading," he said. "I can see that," she said. She sat on the footstool beside the chair. "Can you close it for a moment?" He looked at her then, with the alert assessment he had always had, this quality of reading people, that she recognized as both his own and familiar, in ways she did not look at directly. He closed the book. "Is something wrong?" he said. "No," she said. "Nothing is wrong. I have something to tell you that is true and not bad, just something you should know. Is that all right?" He considered. "Is it about the king from the other kingdom?" She looked at him. "Why do you ask that?" "He looked at me a lot at the reception," Rylan said, with the matter-of-fact attention to detail that characterized him. "And his eyes are like my eyes, I noticed." She held his gaze. "You are very observant," she said. "I know," he said, without pride exactly, just acknowledgement. She sat with her hands in her lap and told him, not the full adult version, the East Corridor, and the mate bond, and the political arithmetic of a king who chose safety over a real thing, but the true version, shaped for someone who was 4 years old and needed the basic shape of it, that before Rylan was born, she had met a man in another kingdom who was important to her, and he had not known about Rylan, and he was here now, and his name was Kalen, and Rylan had come from both of them. Rylan listened with his legs tucked under him, and his book pressed against his chest, and his face doing its thinking expression. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then he said, "Is that why he looks at me?" "Yes," she said. Another pause. "Does Aldrich know?" "Yes," she said. "Aldrich knows everything." He thought about that. She watched him think, and did not rush it. "Is he going to take me somewhere?" Rylan said, and under the question was the only thing close to worry she had seen in his face so far, small but real. She shook her head. "No, you live here. You are not going anywhere. That does not change." He breathed out. "He just wants to meet you," she said, properly, "if you want to meet him." Rylan looked at the window. He looked at the bird book in his hands. He looked at her. "All right," he said, "but I want Aldrich there." "I will ask," she said. He opened his book again. She sat beside him for a while longer, not talking, just present, while he read about birds, and the afternoon light moved across the library floor. He was so himself, she thought, so completely and thoroughly himself. Whatever happened with kings and courts and bloodlines and bond magic, he was going to be exactly this particular person, and no amount of circumstance was going to change that. She put her hand briefly on his head, which he tolerated for approximately 4 seconds, before shifting away, because he was reading, and he needed full concentration for that. She went to find Aldrich. The council meeting happened before the morning of the planned introduction. Aldrich had expected it. There were 12 people on his senior council, and 9 of them had done the same arithmetic he had done 3 years ago, within approximately 12 hours of the Iron Moon delegation arriving, because senior council members were selected specifically for their ability to notice significant things quickly and process them correctly. The question was not whether they would bring it up, but when, and with what tone. They brought it up on the morning of the 3rd summit day, in the formal council chamber, with the Iron Moon advisors not present, which was the correct venue for the conversation. Aldrich sat at the head of the long table and listened. The senior advisor who led the discussion was a careful and precise man named Lawrence, who had been on the council since Aldrich's father's time, and who had the invaluable quality of always saying the hard thing in the most neutral possible way. "The bloodline situation regarding the boy has become apparent to multiple parties," Lawrence said, "both within our court and within the Iron Moon delegation. The question of how Solmir formally addresses this has material implications for the relationship between the two kingdoms, and for the political standing of the child himself." "You can call him Rylan," Aldrich said. Lawrence nodded. "Regarding Rylan, there are several positions available. The first is to acknowledge the biological connection formally, and negotiate with Iron Moon, regarding his status as a Voss heir. The second is to maintain the current status quo and defer any formal acknowledgement. The third is to formally register Rylan in the Solmere court records under your own household, which would clarify his standing here regardless of the Iron Moon question. Aldrich had been thinking about exactly this for 3 years. The third option, he said, with one condition. Lawrence looked at him. Sarah Ashvale is the child's mother, and she has full authority over decisions regarding her son's status and future, Aldrich said. Any formal registration or acknowledgement requires her agreement, given freely and without any pressure from this council or from myself. If she agrees, we proceed. If she does not, we proceed with whatever she prefers. Lawrence considered. And the Iron Moon question? The Iron Moon question is not mine to answer unilaterally, Aldrich said. Kalen Voss is the biological father, and he is in this palace, and capable of being spoken to directly. I will speak to him. We will have a conversation between ourselves, without advisors, and we will determine what both of us can agree on. I will report back. The council would prefer to be more formally involved in... I know what the council would prefer, Aldrich said, with the particular mild finality that his counsel had learned over the years, meant that the discussion was complete. I appreciate the concern. I am going to handle this personally, because it is personal. The council dispersed. Aldrich went to find Kalen. He found him in the east courtyard, which seemed to be where Kalen went when he needed to think, and which Aldrich understood, because the east courtyard had a clear view toward Iron Moon, and there was something grounding about being able to see the direction of home, when everything else was complicated. Walk with me, Aldrich said. They walked out of the palace grounds and into the southern hill path that ran behind the palace, a well-kept track through the woodland that Aldrich used every morning. They walked in silence for the first few minutes, which both of them seemed to need. Aldrich spoke first. I know who Rylan is, he said. I have known for 3 years. I want you to know that I am not telling you this to establish a position or to make a point. I am telling you because I have decided that the most useful thing in this situation is complete honesty between us. Kalen walked beside him without breaking stride. 3 years, he said. The bloodline signature appeared when he shifted, Aldrich said. It is unmistakable to anyone who knows the Voss genealogy. A pause. And you said nothing. To whom? Aldrich said simply. The choice about what to tell you and when was Sarah's, not mine. I did not have the right to make it for her. Kalen was quiet for a moment. You could have sent word to Iron Moon regardless of what she chose, he said. It was not an accusation. It was a real observation. Yes, Aldrich said. I could have. I decided not to. Why? Aldrich thought about how to say what was true without making it into a weapon. Because the decision you made in Iron Moon was complete, he said. You looked at your mate, and you chose something else. That was a real choice with real consequences, and I was not going to reach into those consequences and start rearranging them to suit what I thought a man who had made that choice might prefer. Sarah was managing the consequences of your decision. I was helping her manage them. That was my role. Kalen walked in silence. You could also have refused to help her, he said. You had no obligation. No, Aldrich said. I had no formal obligation, but I do not operate from formal obligations when I can see clearly what is needed. She needed help. Rylan needed someone to be present. I was present. For 4 years. Yes. The path came out of the trees onto a higher section of the hill that gave a view of the Solmere Valley below, the town and the garrison and the green farmland, and beyond it, the beginning of the eastern hills. Aldrich stopped there and let Kalen look at it. He is my son, Kalen said. The words came out with a texture of someone who had been turning them over for days and was finally saying them out loud. He is your son by blood, Aldrich said. He is my son, by every day I have been there. A long silence. I know that, Kalen said. I am not coming here to contest that. I want to be clear about that. He turned to look at Aldrich directly. I have spent 2 days in this kingdom, and I can see what you have built here, and what you have been to him. I am not going to stand across from that and pretend I have a competing claim that overrides it. I made a choice. I live in the shape of that choice. What I am asking for, if it is possible, is something much smaller. Aldrich waited. To know him, Kalen said. Not to replace anyone, or to rearrange anything, but to be someone who exists to him, Someone real, that he can know if he chooses to. He paused. Sarah made the same point to me, that it is his choice. I accept that completely. Aldrich looked at the valley. He thought about Rylan, who was at this moment probably back in the library, or in the garden, or in the stable, asking the grooms questions about the horses, with the relentless, specific curiosity that characterized him. He thought about Rylan at 1 year old, and at 2, and at 3, each stage a distinct person, who was also clearly continuous with the last. This person, who had arrived in a rainstorm, and become the clearest thing in his life. I am going to tell you something, Aldrich said. Not to wound you, and not to put you in your place, because I think you need to hear it from someone who has been watching clearly. Tell me, Kaylin said. He is exceptional, Aldrich said. Not in the way that parents say their children are exceptional, because they are theirs. In the way that some people simply are. He is smart, in the kind of way that will make him very interesting to know when he is older, and potentially very powerful when he is grown. He is kind without being soft. He watches people carefully before he trusts them, which is a skill he has developed from very early. And when he decides to trust someone, that trust is real and deep, and he does not give it again lightly if it is broken. A pause. He is going to know, at some point, exactly who you are, and what happened before he was born. And he is going to decide, in the way he decides all things, what he makes of it. I cannot tell you how that will go. What I can tell you, is that if you want to be someone he trusts, the method is the same as for any person he meets. You show up, you are honest, you let him lead the pace. You do not make him responsible for your feelings about the situation. Kaylin looked at the valley. That is what you did, he said, not a question. That is what I did, Aldrich said. They stood in the warm morning air on the hilltop, with the valley spread out below them, and the distance between them, which was not precisely hostile and not precisely friendly, was the particular distance of two people who had both loved the same people and were trying to figure out if that was possible without damage. I would like to ask you something, Kaylin said. Go ahead. What is between you and Sarah, he said, not as a threat, and not as a question I have any right to an answer to, but because you are the only honest person in my vicinity, and I would rather know than not know. Aldrich considered. I love her, he said, simple and direct, in the way he said all the true things. I have not told her that in so many words because the time has not been right, and I will not rush it to suit my own comfort. But yes, that is what is between us. Kaylin absorbed that. She is building something here, he said, after a moment. Yes, Aldrich said. I can see it is good, Kaylin said. And this sentence, unlike the controlled sentences of a king managing himself in public, carried the raw and specific weight of someone saying a true thing that cost them something. It is very good, Aldrich said. Kaylin turned away from the valley. He turned back toward the palace path. Then I will not put anything in the way of it, he said. Whatever I can be to Rylan, I will be it in a way that does not disturb what you have built here. That is my commitment. Aldrich studied him. He decided, looking at the man, that he believed him. Good, he said. They walked back down the hill together. The morning of the introduction had been set for after the formal summit sessions, when the day's official business was done, and the adults were not in the pressed, formal mode that meetings required. It happened in the palace garden, Sarah's garden, in the early evening when the light was warm and the day was winding down, and Rylan was in the particular mood he got into at this hour, alert but not wound up, present and curious, and not tired yet. Rylan sat on the garden bench with Aldrich beside him, which was where he had said he wanted to be. Sarah stood a few feet away. Kaylin came into the garden through the east archway. He stopped when he saw Rylan, because Rylan was looking at him with the same direct, uninflected assessment he had given him at the reception, the look that withheld judgment until there was enough information to work with. Hello, Rylan said. Hello, Kaylin said. He did not move closer. He stood where he was and let Rylan look at him, and did not fill the silence with anything, which was the right instinct, because Rylan did not respond well to people who came too fast or talked too much. Mama said your name is Kaylin, Rylan said. That is right, Kaylin said. She said I came from both of you, Rylan said. Yes, Kaylin said. Rylan looked at him for another moment. You have the same eyes, he said, for the second time, but differently than the first time. More considered. I thought it was interesting before. Now I know why. Does it feel different? Kalen said. Knowing why? Rylan thought about it with the genuine deliberateness he brought to things. A little, he said. It is more interesting when you know the reason for something. Kalen looked at this child and said nothing for a moment. What do you like to know reasons for? He said. It was the right question. Sarah could feel it from where she stood. Not a performance of interest, but actual curiosity. Ryland's expression shifted slightly. Everything, he said. But mostly birds right now, and pack law. And why some wolves are faster than others, and whether it is training or something they are born with. What do you think? Kalen said. Both, Ryland said. I think you are born with a tendency, and then training decides what happens to it. But Aldrich says the research on that is not settled yet. Kalen glanced at Aldrich. He is not wrong, Aldrich said. Ryland looked satisfied with this. I usually am not wrong, he said, with a simple confidence that was entirely without arrogance, and was somehow the funnier for it. Kalen almost smiled. Sarah could see it at the corner of his mouth. Can I sit down? Kalen said to Rylan. Not to Sarah. Not to Aldrich. To Rylan. Rylan looked at the bench, and at Aldrich, and at the open ground of the garden. You can sit there, he said, pointing at the low stone garden wall a few feet from the bench, which was close, but not adjacent. Kalen sat where he was pointed. They talked for 40 minutes about birds and pack law and wolves who ran fast, and whether the eastern hills of Solmere had different prey patterns than the northern hills, which Rylan had a theory about, and which Kalen, to Sarah's genuine surprise, was able to engage with specifically because Iron Moon's highland territory had a similar dynamic that he had observed from years of running it. Rylan listened to that with the particular quality of interest he showed when he encountered information that was actually new to him. At the end of 40 minutes, when the garden had gone dark and one of the palace staff had appeared to let Sarah know dinner was ready, Rylan stood up and stretched with the full-body commitment of someone who had been sitting still longer than usual. He looked at Kalen. Are you staying for dinner? He said. Kalen looked at Sarah. She looked back at him. Only if it is all right with everyone, Kalen said. Rylan looked at Aldrich. It is all right with me, Aldrich said. Rylan nodded. All right, he said, with the same tone of accepting a negotiated settlement. He walked toward the palace entrance. He stopped in the archway and looked back. You can come, he said to Kalen, in the tone of someone who had made a decision and was not making a ceremony of it. Then he went inside. Sarah stood in the garden with the two men and the evening air around them, and felt something that had been tightly wound in her chest since the day she saw the summit request arrive in Aldrich's correspondence finally release its grip. Not all the way, not forever, but enough. She looked at Aldrich, and he was already looking at her, and in his face was the same thing she felt, the quiet, reliable warmth of a person who had been there through all of it, and was here now, and was not going anywhere. She looked at Kalen. He was looking at the archway where Rylan had disappeared. He is exactly as you described, he said quietly. Yes, she said. He is exactly himself. He looked at her. Thank you, he said, for what you raised him into. She held his gaze. He raised himself, she said. We just showed up. She turned and walked into the palace for dinner. After a moment, she heard two sets of footsteps following her. Different gaits, different weights, the careful space between them that was not hostility, and was not friendship, but was the first, careful, entirely real beginning of something that did not have a name yet. She was all right with that. She was, in fact, better than all right. She walked into the warm light of the dining room and sat down, and Rylan was already in his chair, with his napkin deployed and his book on birds stashed under the seat for later, and he looked up at her with the gray-silver eyes that were entirely his own, and said, in the casual tone of someone moving from one interesting topic to the next, Kalen knows about the Highland deer migration. We should write that down. After dinner, she said. Obviously, he said, and reached for the bread. 3 years after the summit, Sarah stood in the great hall of Solmere Palace in a dress the color of winter sky, and said the words that meant she was choosing this. She said them to Aldrich, who stood across from her in his formal Solmere grey, with the silver ring on his right hand, that he had moved to his right hand deliberately, she knew, not hiding it, not erasing it, honoring it, as the thing it was, while also making room for this new thing, which was so like him, that she had held the image of it in her chest for weeks. Ryland stood as witness. He was 7 now, and he stood between them with the formal composure of someone who had been told this was an important ceremony, and had decided to be equal to the importance of it, which meant he was absolutely still, in a way he never was at any other time, because Ryland in motion was always already heading somewhere, but Ryland standing still for something that mattered was one of the most genuinely impressive things she had ever seen. He held the small carved wolf from Aldrich's nursery in both hands, because he had brought it from his room that morning saying it should be there, and no one had argued with him. Sarah said the words and meant them entirely. Aldrich said the words and his voice was even and warm and entirely present, the way his voice always was when he was saying the true things, rather than the ceremonial ones, and she knew the difference by now. Knew every register of him the way you knew the particular rooms of a house you had lived in long enough to navigate in the dark. The hall witnesses raised their voices in the traditional acknowledgement. She looked at Aldrich. He looked at her. Something settled in the room around them with the quiet finality of a door that has been waiting to close properly, and has finally done it. The celebration afterward was a real one, which was to say it was not the kind of event that performed celebration, but was actually full of it. People who were genuinely glad for something, eating and talking and making noise in the way that celebrations did, when no one was watching themselves closely enough to be restrained. Aldrich's counsel was there, and Ellis from the garrison, who had come in from the south wearing the same work-worn clothes she wore everywhere, and who had shaken Sarah's hand with a grip that communicated 14 things at once, including well done, and about time, and also, I am not going to make a fuss about any of this, but you should know I mean it. Ryland ate more than his negotiated amount at the table, and no one said anything about it, because it was that kind of evening. Kaelin was not at the celebration. He had attended the preceding summit, which had become an annual event in the 3 years since the first one, and he had sent a formal letter through the Iron Moon diplomatic channel when the ceremony was announced, a careful and honest letter that Sarah had read 3 times and kept, which expressed genuine goodwill and an equally genuine acknowledgement that he would not be present, because his presence would complicate a day that deserved to be uncomplicated. He had been that careful about things consistently for 3 years. He came to Solmere twice a year now. The first visit was the annual summit, which had become genuinely substantive. The Brackwall situation had been resolved through the joint survey method she had suggested 3 years ago, and there were now 3 ongoing trade agreements and a shared patrol arrangement along the eastern border that had improved both kingdoms' security in ways that justified every hour of negotiation. The second visit was shorter, 2 or 3 days, and had nothing diplomatic attached to it. It was simply a visit. Ryland had named these visits the Grey Eye visits, because Kaelin had grey eyes and came to visit, which was the kind of naming logic that made complete sense to a 7-year-old and had become, over 3 years, simply what they were called. Kaelin had been careful in these visits in the way he had promised to be careful, which was to say he came without agenda and without making Ryland responsible for anything. He brought things sometimes, not extravagant things but things that fit, a particular tracking manual that he had obtained from the Iron Moon Highland records that discussed the deer migration patterns Ryland had been interested in, a detailed map of the Northern Territories with elevation lines that Ryland had studied for 2 days and then used to redesign his mental model of how highland terrain affected wolf running patterns. He brought these things and gave them, without requiring anything in return, and let Ryland decide how much conversation he wanted, and whether he was interested, and how far he was willing to let the acquaintance develop. Ryland was interested. He was interested the way he was interested in everything, with the particular methodical appetite of a person who wanted to understand things fully, before he decided how he felt about them. He had questions for Kaelin, many of them, some of them about the deer and the terrain and Iron Moon's hunting culture, and some of them, increasingly as he got older, about other things. Sarah had been present for the day, 2 years into the visits, when Ryland asked Kaelin directly why he had not known about him. She had been across the room when it happened, far enough that she might not have been expected to hear, which she suspected Ryland had calculated, because he was someone who thought about where to have difficult conversations, and with whom. She stayed where she was and listened. Kalen had answered honestly. He had not used the soft version that would have protected him. He said that he had made a decision that Ryland's mother leave Ironmoon because he had other plans for his kingdom, that he thought the mate bond would complicate, and that it was not until a report arrived years later that he learned about Rylan, and that by then, Rylan had been in Solmere for years, and she had not told him, because she was honoring the decision he had made. Rylan had listened. Then he had said, was it the wrong decision? Kalen had said yes. Rylan had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, Aldrich says that wrong decisions are more useful than right ones, if you actually learn from them. Aldrich is right, Kalen said. Are you learning from it? Rylan said. I am trying to, Kalen said. Rylan had accepted that with a nod that was very much his mother's nod, the small one that meant, I have taken this on board, and will be watching to see if it is true. She had watched from across the room. She had felt, quietly and without sentiment, that something had been handled correctly, not because it was resolved in a way that erased the damage or rewrote the history, but because the truth of it had been said plainly to the person who most needed to hear it, and that person had the tools to do something real with it. That was all you could ask. The celebration wound down in the late evening, people making their way home, or to their palace rooms, the hall gradually emptying, until it was just the inner circle, Aldrich's closest advisors, and Ellis and Marin the healer, and a few of the garrison wolves, who had become something like family over the years. Rylan fell asleep in a chair in the corner at some point, his book on birds open on his lap, head tipped sideways, deeply and immediately unconscious in the way of children, who had been holding themselves upright for a significant occasion, and had finally been given permission by their bodies to stop. Aldrich carried him to his room. He came back and found Sarah at the window that looked over the southern garden, the garden that was hers, that had been hers since the early days when it was still the palace's garden, and she had been a garrison wolf with a borrowed house in the town. He came and stood beside her. How are you? He said. She looked at the garden. The moonlight was on the east wall, the same wall that had been lit by evening sun, the night he had sat with her, and she had said, your company helps. The first time she had said that kind of thing out loud, to anyone in a very long time. Complete, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. And then he said, in the way he said the true things, simply and without announcement, I love you. I have loved you for a long time. I told myself there would be a better moment to say it, but I do not think a better moment is actually coming, and I am tired of waiting for it. She turned to look at him. He looked back at her with the amber eyes that were still, after all this time, difficult to look away from, the eyes of someone who looked at things instead of glancing at them. I know, she said. He raised an eyebrow very slightly. I have known for a while, she said. I was waiting for you to say it. You could have said it first, he said. I know, she said. I was not ready first. He considered that, and now? She looked at him. She thought about the shepherd's hut in the rainstorm, and the garrison library in the winter dark, and the garrison yard, where she had watched him move through his inspection, with the attention of someone who actually cared about what he found. She thought about the infirmary, and the small hand in his careful hands, and the carved wolf on the windowsill. She thought about 4 years, and the dinner table, and the book on Ryland's face, and every ordinary day that had built this life, without her noticing how solid it had become. Now, she said. She said it, and then she said the other words, the ones she had been carrying for a while, and the garden was outside the window, and the moon was on the wall, and Ryland was asleep in his room with his bird's book, and in Ironmoon, 500 miles west, a king was sitting at his desk in his study, not writing in his journal, which was what he did when he was thinking about something he could not say out loud. Kalen Voss had received the formal notification of the ceremony through diplomatic channels. He had written his letter of goodwill and sent it with a rider. He had gone back to governing his kingdom, which was what he had chosen and what he was good at, and what he would continue to do, because kingdoms did not wait for kings to finish being sad about the things they had chosen. The Ironmoon court had, over the 3 years since the summit, quietly and without drama, begun to raise the question of succession, because Kalen and Dagna had not produced an heir, and the Voss bloodline required one. This conversation happened at the edges of formal meetings, in the sideways language of people who understood that the topic was delicate. Kalen was aware of it. He handled it the way he handled most things now, with the measured, honest engagement of a man who had spent 3 years doing the difficult work of becoming more honest with himself. He had told Dagna everything, privately, 6 months after the summit. She had listened with the precision of a woman who processed information exactly as it arrived, and did not add anything to it that was not there. She had been quiet for a long time, and then she had said, "The child is in Solmir, and he is being raised well, and you are visiting twice a year." "Yes," Kalen said. "And the situation with Sarah?" "She is building a life there," he said. "Aldrich is the man she is building it with." Another pause. "Is that a loss you are still managing?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said. "But it is my loss to manage, not anyone else's. I made the choices that led to it." She had nodded. She had looked out the window. She had said, "After a long time, I think we have been doing this marriage an injustice, by not talking about these things." He had agreed. It did not become a love story between them. They were not built for that, and both of them understood it. But in the year after that conversation, they became something more than they had been. More honest, more present, more willing to acknowledge the shape of the thing they had actually built, rather than the shape they had publicly described. They began to talk the way people talked, when they had stopped performing their relationship for other people, and were simply in it. It was quieter than romance. It was more durable than many things that called themselves love. The succession question Kalen resolved by beginning a formal process that Iron Moon law allowed, but rarely used. The designation of a named heir outside the direct bloodline, a senior pack member of demonstrated leadership. It was not the traditional path. The council had extensive feelings about it. He listened to the feelings, and then he proceeded, because he had learned, slowly and with significant difficulty, that the right decision and the easy decision were frequently not the same thing, and that the difference between them was something you could see clearly once you had made enough wrong ones. Rylan grew. He grew with the particular speed of children, which was to say completely and all at once, and then you looked at them and thought, when did that happen? At 10 he was already showing the physical build that would eventually match the silver-gray wolf, broad through the shoulders, long in the leg, moving with the economic precision of someone who had been tracking since before he could read. He asked more questions about Iron Moon as he got older. He asked Kalen about the Highland territory and the great pack traditions and the history of the Voss line, and Kalen answered all of it with the careful honesty he had committed to, including the parts of the history that did not reflect well on the Voss line, because he had decided that if there was one thing Ryland deserved, it was an accurate picture of where he came from. He also asked Aldrich about Solmir's history, and Aldrich gave him the same thing, the full version, including the difficult chapters. Ryland absorbed it all and became, Sarah thought, someone who understood both of where he came from, and was therefore not defined entirely by either. He was himself. He had always been himself. The information that came in just became part of the material he worked with. He was 12 when he asked her. In the direct and considered way he asked everything, whether she thought he would ever want to go to Iron Moon. She thought about the answer carefully. "Do you want to?" she said. He thought about it. "I am curious about it," he said. "In the way I am curious about things I have learned about, but not seen. I want to know if it is what I imagine." "That is a good reason to go," she said. Aldrich would come, he said. It was not a question. "If you asked him," she said, "yes." "Would you?" She looked at her son with his silver-gray eyes and his mother's jaw, and the question in his face that was straightforward and genuine, and not performing anything. She thought about the eastern gate at dawn, the cold road, the birds returning the other birds' call. "Yes," she said, "if you wanted me there." He nodded slowly. "I think I will go," he said, "when I am ready. I am not ready yet." "Take your time," she said. He went back to his book. She sat with the window open, and the spring air coming through it, and thought about the years that had passed, and the shape they had made, the shape of a life built out of a single difficult decision to keep walking east. She had walked east, and found a rainstorm, and a shepherd's hut, and a man with amber eyes who had asked, "Are you safe?" and she had not known how to answer. She knew how to answer now. The answer was yes. The answer was completely and unreservedly yes, and not because nothing difficult had ever happened, but because she had walked through the difficult things and arrived, still standing, at exactly this. She thought about Kalen, who was in Ironmoon right now at his desk, governing his kingdom in the careful and honest way he had learned to govern, building something better than what he had started with, which was all any person could do. She thought about Aldrich, who was in the palace library at this hour, which was where he always was at this hour, and who would look up when she came in with 2 cups of tea, and say thank you in the particular way he had of saying it that meant it fully. She thought about Rylan, who would go to Ironmoon when he was ready, and would look at it with his clear and comprehensive attention, and would decide what he thought of it and where he fit relative to it, and who would do all of this on his own terms, and in his own time, because he had been raised by people who understood that was the only way worth doing it. She got up and made 2 cups of tea. She carried them down the hall to the library. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, and he looked up from his book the way he always did, with the full attention he brought to everything, and he said thank you, and she sat down across from him and opened her own book, and the evening light moved across the floor between them, in the slow and particular way of evenings in Solmere, which she knew so well now that she would have recognized it anywhere. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had arranged it, because she had learned, over many years, and at significant personal cost, that fate was a word people used for things they had not yet understood, were made of choices. She had made choices. She had walked east when walking east was hard. She had kept herself upright when being upright cost everything she had. She had built, one ordinary day at a time, a life that was genuinely hers. This was it. She turned a page. The evening settled around them, warm and quiet and entirely real, and outside the window the first stars were coming in, over the southern hills of Solmere, the same hills she had looked at from the garrison on her first winter night here, the same hills Aldrich had said were very beautiful if you could tolerate the cold. She had tolerated the cold. She had earned the view.